In the spring of 1928, 12 people descended into a chamber beneath the Giza Plateau that, according to every official record, does not exist. They were credentialed scientists, experienced surveyors, and respected academics. They carried state-of-the-art equipment for the era, secured multiple excavation permits, and documented their work with the meticulous precision expected of professional archaeological operations. Then, systematically and deliberately, nearly every trace of their expedition was erased from history. Dr. Heinrich Vogel, the German archaeologist who led the mission, vanished without explanation after checking into a Cairo hotel. His employment records were scrubbed from institutional archives. The permits his team obtained were reassigned to other projects as if they had never been issued. Edmund Blackwood, the British surveyor whose diary provides our most detailed account of what they found, returned to England psychologically shattered, seeking treatment for anxiety so severe that his physician warned him never to speak of Egypt again. Marcus Reeves, the Cambridge astronomer who made calculations he called irrefutable but too extraordinary to commit to paper, never reached home to present his findings. What did they discover in those lightless passages beneath the Sphinx? What evidence did they document that required such comprehensive suppression? And why, nearly a century later, do multiple governments still maintain active interest in a chamber they insist doesn't exist? For the next 3 hours, we'll follow the fragmentary evidence scattered across archives on 3 continents, examining not just what this expedition found, but the extraordinary lengths taken to ensure you would never hear this story. The truth, as you're about to discover, has been buried far deeper than any pharaoh's tomb. The official records are clear. No archaeological mission was granted permission to enter the Giza Plateau between March and September of 1928. Yet buried in the personal diary of British surveyor Edmund Blackwood, dated May 17th of that year, lies a detailed account of descending into a chamber that, according to every map and survey conducted since, should not exist. His entries describe limestone walls carved with symbols that matched no known Egyptian dynasty, a passage sloping at precisely 26 degrees into bedrock that predated the pyramids themselves, and a discovery so unsettling that the expedition's 12 members were sworn to silence under threat of imprisonment. Blackwood's diary surfaced in 2003 during the estate sale of his granddaughter in Southampton, tucked inside a leather portfolio that hadn't been opened in decades. The pages, yellowed but remarkably preserved, contain not just written accounts, but detailed sketches of hieroglyphs that Egyptologists have since confirmed bear no resemblance to any catalogued ancient Egyptian writing system. The precision of his technical drawings measurements accurate to the millimeter. Geological observations that align with modern seismic data suggest these weren't the fever dreams of an imaginative storyteller, but the careful documentation of a trained professional recording something he genuinely encountered. What makes Blackwood's account particularly compelling is the corroboration found in fragments of correspondence between colonial office administrators in Cairo. A coded telegram dated June 3, 1928, references the Blackwood matter and instructs the recipient to ensure complete discretion regarding the plateau incident. Another letter, partially redacted, mentions the immediate recall of a survey team and the confiscation of photographic equipment. These administrative breadcrumbs paint a picture of an operation that officially never happened, but unofficially triggered significant concern at the highest levels of British colonial administration. The 12 expedition members Blackwood references have proven remarkably difficult to trace. 7 names appear in his diary, but conventional historical records show these individuals in entirely different locations during the spring of 1928. Thomas Rutherford, listed as the expedition's geologist, was supposedly lecturing at Cambridge throughout May. Margaret Chen, described as the team's translator fluent in Coptic and Ancient Greek, has no verifiable existence in any academic record of the period. This systematic erasure of evidence suggests not merely bureaucratic oversight, but a coordinated effort to remove all traces of the expedition from the historical record. The chamber, Blackwood described, contained architectural features that challenged fundamental assumptions about the technological capabilities of pre-dynastic civilizations. He documented perfectly circular boreholes in granite, smooth internal corners indicating advanced stoneworking techniques, and a ventilation system that suggested sophisticated understanding of airflow and pressure. His measurements placed the chamber's construction at least 1,000 years before the accepted timeline for the pyramids themselves, raising uncomfortable questions about who built these structures and what knowledge they possessed that has since been lost to time. Perhaps most disturbing was Blackwood's final entry, written in noticeably shakier handwriting. He described finding inscriptions that appeared to be counting down to a specific date, mathematical calculations that suggested astronomical knowledge far beyond what should have been possible, and a central artifact that his training couldn't adequately explain. The entry ends abruptly mid-sentence. The others insist we must seal the passage and never speak of what lies beneath. The rest of the page had been torn away, leaving only ragged edges and unanswered questions that have haunted researchers for decades. In the spring of 1928, Dr. Heinrich Vogel of the Berlin Archaeological Institute submitted 3 separate applications to the Egyptian Antiquities Service for excavation rights near the Sphinx. Each application listed different project goals. One focused on pottery analysis, another on tomb restoration, and the third on geological surveying of subsurface anomalies. The permits were approved within days of each other, an unusual speed for the notoriously bureaucratic department. When historians attempted to verify these documents in the 1,970 seconds, they found that all 3 permit numbers had been reassigned to unrelated digs, and Dr. Vogel's name appeared nowhere in the Institute's employment records for that decade. The administrative puzzle deepens when examining the signature patterns on the approval stamps. Egyptian Antiquities Service documents from 1928 followed a strict protocol requiring signatures from 3 separate department heads before excavation could proceed. The Vogel permits contained these signatures, but forensic analysis conducted in 1982 revealed that 2 of the 3 signatures were forgeries. Skillful ones that replicated the correct official's handwriting but contained subtle pressure variations, indicating they were copied rather than originally penned. The 3rd signature belonged to an administrator who, according to payroll records, had resigned 6 months before the permits were allegedly issued. What makes this documentary mystery particularly intriguing is the pattern of similar irregularities surrounding other archaeological activities during the same period. Between February and August of 1928, at least 9 different excavation permits show signs of administrative tampering. Some contain approval dates that fall on Egyptian public holidays when government offices were closed. Others reference archaeological sites using designations that wouldn't be officially adopted until the 1,930 seconds. One permit authorises excavation at a location that geological surveys confirm was underwater due to seasonal Nile flooding during the date specified. The reassignment of Vogel's permit numbers appears to have been executed with bureaucratic precision sometime in the early 1,930 seconds. Researchers discovered that the new digs assigned these numbers were legitimate operations, but their paperwork contained subtle anomalies. Application dates were altered, submission timestamps showed impossible sequences, and supporting documentation referenced protocols that didn't exist until years later. Someone had methodically gone through the archives and created a new paper trail that overwrote the original records, burying Vogel's expedition under layers of manufactured bureaucratic history. Dr. Vogel himself remains an enigma, wrapped in contradictory evidence. A photograph from a 1927 archaeological conference in Munich clearly shows a man identified in the caption as Dr. H. Vogel, Berlin Archaeological Institute. He appears in the background of 3 other photographs from the same event, always slightly out of focus, always positioned at the edges of the frame. Yet the Institute's official roster for 1927 and 1928 contains no Heinrich Vogel. Staff directories, payroll records, publication lists, every conventional source for confirming his employment draws a blank, as if someone carefully erased his professional existence while leaving just enough photographic evidence to prove he once stood in those rooms. The geological surveying permit the 3rd application Vogel submitted contained the most revealing language. Buried in the technical jargon about subsurface anomalies was a request for permission to use electromagnetic detection equipment and to conduct deep structural analysis beneath existing monuments. This was technology that wouldn't become standard in archaeology for another 40 years. Either Vogel was remarkably ahead of his time, or the permit was requesting access to something that required tools beyond conventional excavation. The fact that this particular document was the most thoroughly scrubbed from the archives suggests it came closest to revealing the expedition's true purpose. Heinrich Vogel was last photographed on the deck of the SS Merkur in Alexandria Harbour. On March 3, 1928, standing beside 4 wooden crates labelled "Surveying Equipment" in neat black stencil, the ship's manifest confirmed his passenger booking to Cairo, and hotel records show he checked into the Shepherd's Hotel 2 days later. After that, the documentary trail goes cold. His room was paid for through the end of June, but staff reported the bed appeared unused after the first week. The German consulate filed a missing persons report in July, yet the investigation was quietly closed within a month with no explanation in the official summary. The contents of those 4 crates have become a source of considerable speculation among researchers. Customs documentation from Alexandria Port lists the crates as containing theodolites, measuring chains, and photographic apparatus, standard equipment for any archaeological surveyor of the period. However, a handwritten notation in the margin of the customs form, discovered during a 2008 archive review, reads, "Additional inspection required, magnetic interference noted." This cryptic comment suggests the crates contained something that disrupted the port's compass equipment, an impossibility if they held only conventional surveying tools. Whatever Vogel transported into Egypt was substantial enough to warrant 4 reinforced crates and possessed properties that concerned customs officials. Witnesses place Vogel at various locations around Cairo during early March, though their accounts contain puzzling inconsistencies. A waiter at the hotel's restaurant remembered serving him breakfast on March 7th, noting that Vogel studied maps throughout the meal and seemed agitated, constantly checking his pocket watch. A taxi driver's log records a fare matching Vogel's description travelling to the Giza Plateau on March 10th, with the unusual detail that the passenger requested to be dropped at the northwest perimeter, away from the main tourist entrance. A shopkeeper near Khan el-Khalili recalled selling Vogel a substantial quantity of rope, lanterns, and what he described as climbing equipment on March 12th. Then, abruptly, the sightings cease. The Shepherd's hotel room provides the most tangible clues to Vogel's activities during those mysterious days. When the staff finally entered the room in early July, they found it in a state of careful organisation rather than abandonment. His personal effects remained neatly arranged, his clothes hung in the wardrobe, his toiletries lined up precisely on the bathroom shelf. The bed had been made with hospital corners, the writing desk cleared of all papers. The only item out of place was a compass sitting on the windowsill, its needle spinning slowly in endless circles, unable to find magnetic north. Hotel engineers tested the compass in other rooms and found it functioned normally. Something about Vogel's specific room had permanently disrupted the instrument's ability to orient itself. The German consulate's investigation, though brief, uncovered several troubling details before its sudden closure. Who reported receiving a telegram from him on March 15th, stating he had made contact with local experts and would be unreachable for several weeks. The telegram originated from a post office in Giza, but the clerk who allegedly sent it had no memory of the transaction. Bank records showed Vogel had withdrawn a substantial sum in Egyptian pounds on March 14th, enough to fund several months of living expenses. Yet none of this money was found among his possessions at the hotel. Most disturbing was the final entry in the consulate's investigative file, a single sentence written in red ink and initialed by the consul himself. Advised by British authorities to discontinue inquiries, matter involves security considerations beyond consular jurisdiction. This notation transforms Vogel's disappearance from a simple missing persons case into something far more complex, suggesting his vanishing was observed, perhaps even facilitated, by parties with enough authority to shut down an official government investigation. The last page of Edmund Blackwood's diary, dated September 12, 1928, breaks from his typically measured prose into something approaching panic. The handwriting grows erratic. The letters press so hard into the paper that some words tore through to the page beneath. He describes a disagreement within the group about whether to seal the chamber they had discovered, mentions calculations that Reeves insists prove we've made an error, and ends with a single underlined sentence. If we are right about the age, then everything must be reconsidered. The diary was found in a storage unit in Manchester in 1983, sold at auction with a collection of his other effects after his daughter's death. The transformation in Blackwood's writing style across the diary's final pages reveals a man wrestling with discoveries that challenged his fundamental understanding of history. Earlier entries showcase the meticulous documentation of a trained surveyor, precise measurements, clinical observations, technical sketches rendered with architectural precision. But by early September, entire passages dissolve into fragmented thoughts and half-finished sentences. One particularly striking section reads, "The stratification cannot be reconciled." With Margaret insists the linguistic patterns suggest Vogel's instruments confirm depths that these incomplete thoughts suggest a team overwhelmed by evidence that contradicted everything their training had taught them to expect. The mention of Reeves provides one of the few identifiable connections to other expedition members. Cross-referencing with academic records from the period reveals a Jonathan Reeves who published papers on astronomical calculations in ancient structures during the 1920 seconds. His mathematical work focused on precession of equinoxes and how ancient civilizations might have encoded astronomical knowledge in architectural alignments. If this is the same Reeves referenced in Blackwood's diary, his presence on the expedition suggests they encountered something requiring sophisticated mathematical analysis, possibly astronomical calculations embedded in the chamber's design, or inscriptions that contain numerical sequences demanding expert interpretation. The physical condition of the diary itself tells a story beyond the words on its pages. Water damage affects several sections, with brownish stains that testing has confirmed are consistent with Nile River water. This suggests the diary was exposed to flooding or was deliberately submerged, possibly during an attempt to conceal it. More intriguing are the small, deliberate cuts in the margins of certain pages, precise slices that removed specific portions of text while leaving the rest intact. Someone, perhaps Blackwood himself or possibly another party who gained access to the diary, methodically excised particular information. The cuts are too surgical to be accidental damage, too targeted to be random deterioration. Blackwood's final sentence, "If we are right about the age, then everything must be reconsidered," has become a source of intense debate among researchers. The word age appears underlined 3 times, the repetitive strokes suggesting either emphasis or agitation as he wrote. Dating ancient structures with precision was challenging in 1928, before radiocarbon testing and modern archaeological techniques. For Blackwood to express such certainty about age suggests they discovered something that provided unmistakable chronological evidence, perhaps organic materials embedded in sealed contexts or geological formations that could only have developed over specific timescales. The phrase "everything must be reconsidered" carries profound implications. Blackwood wasn't simply suggesting minor adjustments to archaeological timelines or refinements of existing theories. His words indicate a discovery so fundamentally incompatible with accepted historical narratives that it would require rebuilding the entire framework of ancient Egyptian chronology. This wasn't a matter of finding an undiscovered tomb or identifying a new pharaoh. This was evidence that challenged the very foundations of how civilization developed in the Nile Valley. The storage unit where the diary was discovered contained other items from Blackwood's estate, but notably absent were any photographs, technical drawings, or survey equipment from his Egyptian period. His daughter had apparently retained personal items, clothing, letters, books, but everything connected to his professional work in Egypt had vanished. The diary survived only because it had been tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of a surveying manual, hidden so well that even family members didn't know of its existence until the estate was liquidated decades after his death. Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted around the Giza pyramids consistently detect hollow spaces beneath the plateau's surface, networks of tunnels and chambers that don't appear on any historical map. In 2009, Japanese researchers from Waseda University identified what appeared to be a systematic grid of passages running at depths between 15 and 40 meters below ground level, far deeper than known tomb complexes. When they attempted to match these anomalies against geological surveys from the 1922nd, they found several key documents missing from the Egyptian Museum's archives. Their catalogue numbers present, but the files themselves gone without any record of removal or transfer. The pattern of these subterranean voids suggests intentional design rather than natural limestone cave formation. The tunnels maintain consistent widths, averaging 2.3 meters, run in predominantly straight lines with precise angular turns, and intersect at regular intervals that imply mathematical planning. Dr. Sakuji Yoshimura, who led the Waseda team, noted that the passages form geometric patterns when viewed from above triangular configurations that mirror the surface arrangement of the pyramids themselves, but inverted and positioned deeper in the bedrock. This symmetry between surface monuments and subsurface architecture hints at a unified construction project far more extensive than previously imagined. What makes these findings particularly significant is their correspondence with historical accounts that predate modern scanning technology. A British geological survey from 1882 contains passing references to structural anomalies detected during water table measurements near the Sphinx. The surveyor noted unexpected echo patterns when using percussion methods to test rock density, suggesting hollow spaces where solid limestone should exist. His recommendations for further investigation were apparently ignored, and subsequent surveys made no mention of these anomalies, as if later researchers had been instructed to avoid certain areas or had been provided with maps that deliberately omitted these features. The missing archival documents create a conspicuous gap in the historical record. The catalogue system at the Egyptian Museum's research library is meticulous, with entries dating back to the institution's founding in 1902. Each document receives a unique identifier that remains permanent regardless of the file's location or status. The Waseda researchers discovered that catalogue numbers EGM1928G04 through EGM1928G053 all corresponded to geological surveys conducted around Giza during the spring and summer of 1928. The index cards for these files still exist, containing brief descriptions like subsurface cavity mapping, western plateau, and vertical shaft documentation, Sphinx perimeter. But the files themselves have vanished, leaving only empty folders with faint impressions where stamps and signatures once appeared. Archive staff could provide no explanation for the missing documents. There were no checkout records, no transfer logs, no notation of deterioration or loss. The files simply weren't there, despite the fact that their catalogue cards indicated they should occupy specific positions in the storage system. Even more puzzling, the empty folders showed signs of recent handling. They weren't covered in decades of dust, like surrounding materials, suggesting someone had accessed them within the last few years, examining or removing contents while leaving the folders in place to avoid drawing attention to the gap. Attempts to excavate or explore these detected voids have been consistently blocked by Egyptian authorities. When international teams submit proposals to investigate the anomalies, applications disappear into bureaucratic limbo, receiving neither approval nor formal rejection. In 2011, a French team obtained preliminary permission to conduct limited excavation near a particularly strong radar signature, only to have their permit revoked 48 hours before work was scheduled to begin. The official explanation cited preservation concerns, but team members reported seeing evidence that the site had been recently disturbed: fresh tool marks on stone, excavated material that hadn't had time to weather, and barriers erected around the area that bore no government markings. The most detailed radar imaging, conducted in 2015 using equipment sensitive enough to distinguish between air-filled voids and water-filled spaces, revealed something unexpected. Several of the deeper chambers showed signs of standing water, but with properties that didn't match the surrounding water table. The electromagnetic signature suggested high mineral content, or possibly dissolved metals, creating a conductive environment that distorted readings and made precise mapping impossible. One researcher described it as trying to see through a mirror. The instruments detected something below, but the reflective properties of whatever filled those spaces prevented clear imaging of their true extent or contents. References to a secret society called the Brotherhood of the Eternal Lamp appear scattered through archaeological correspondence of the 1,920 seconds, always in vague terms, never with specific details. French Egyptologist Pierre Lecoux mentioned them in a letter to his colleague Émile Barizet in 1927, describing them as watchers who have guarded certain knowledge since the time of the late period, and suggesting they had influence within the Antiquities Service itself. British researcher Margaret Murray wrote dismissively of local superstitions about guardian brotherhoods in her 1929 field notes, but added a curious addendum: though I confess their predictions about the German expedition proved unnervingly accurate, the name itself carries symbolic weight within Egyptian mystical traditions. The Eternal Lamp references the Ner Tamid concept found in various ancient cultures, a light that must never be extinguished, representing preserved knowledge passed down through generations. In Egyptian context, such lamps were said to burn in the deepest temple sanctuaries, tended by priests who inherited secrets too dangerous or sacred for public knowledge. If the Brotherhood took this name, they were positioning themselves as guardians of information that had survived since pharaonic times, maintained in unbroken succession across millennia of conquest, cultural change, and religious transformation. Evidence of the Brotherhood's influence appears in patterns of denied excavation permits and mysteriously cancelled digs. Archaeological teams that approached certain areas of the Giza Plateau during the 1,920 seconds encountered unexpected obstacles, permits suddenly revoked, local workers refusing employment despite generous wages, equipment deliveries that never arrived. American archaeologist Howard Carter, famous for discovering Tutankhamun's tomb, noted in private correspondence that 2 of his planned surveys near the Sphinx were discouraged by parties who seemed to possess considerable administrative reach. He never identified these parties by name, but the timing of his cancelled permits coincided with other instances where the Brotherhood was rumoured to have intervened. The most detailed account of an encounter with the Brotherhood comes from an unpublished memoir by Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti. Writing in 1931, 2 years before his death, Barsanti described a meeting in a Cairo coffee house with a man who identified himself only as a keeper of the old ways. This individual demonstrated intimate knowledge of Barsanti's excavation plans, including details that should have been known only to his immediate team. The keeper warned Barsanti that certain chambers beneath the plateau were sealed by authority older than the pharaohs, and that attempts to breach these seals would be met with consequences. Barsanti dismissed this as theatrical intimidation, but his planned excavation was abandoned 3 weeks later when his primary financial backer inexplicably withdrew all funding. Margaret Murray's reference to the Brotherhood's predictions about the German expedition becomes particularly significant when examined alongside the timeline of Vogel's disappearance. Her field notes from March 1928 record a conversation with an Egyptian antiquities official who warned her that the Germans are investigating matters they do not understand, and that the Brotherhood has taken notice. This conversation occurred on March 11th, one day after Vogel was last reliably sighted travelling to Giza. Murray's initial skepticism gave way to unease when Vogel vanished, and the expedition's permits were systematically erased from official records, exactly as the Brotherhood had allegedly predicted would happen to those who disturbed the old seals. The organizational structure of the Brotherhood remains deliberately obscure, but fragmentary evidence suggests a hierarchy spanning both Egyptian nationals and foreign collaborators. Members apparently held positions throughout the colonial administration, the Antiquities Service, and academic institutions, allowing them to monitor archaeological activities and intervene when necessary. Their authority seems to have derived not from official government backing, but from institutional knowledge. They knew which officials to approach, which bureaucratic levers to pull, and possessed information that gave them leverage over decision-makers. This suggests an organization that had spent generations embedding itself within Egypt's power structures, establishing influence through patient cultivation rather than overt control. The Brotherhood's ultimate purpose remains a subject of speculation. Were they protecting genuinely dangerous knowledge that could destabilize historical understanding? Were they preserving archaeological sites from premature excavation by researchers lacking proper reverence or preparation? Or were they guarding something more tangible, artifacts, texts or technologies hidden beneath the plateau that they believed the world was not ready to receive? The fact that the Brotherhood's interventions intensified during the late 1922 suggests they viewed that period as particularly critical, a moment when advancing archaeological techniques and growing international interest threatened to expose secrets they had successfully protected for centuries. Among Edmund Blackwood's possessions sold at auction was a leather camera case containing a Kodak vest pocket camera and 3 rolls of undeveloped film. The buyer, a photography enthusiast named Michael Hendricks, had the film professionally developed in 1984, curious about what images a 1922 surveyor might have captured. 2 rolls showed the expected scenes: the Sphinx, pyramid exteriors, camp life, and group photographs of men in colonial-era field gear. The 3rd roll emerged completely black, every single frame, as though exposed to light or subjected to some form of radiation that had ruined the emulsion entirely, despite the protective metal canister showing no signs of being opened. The photographs from the first 2 rolls provide valuable documentation of the expedition's surface activities and help identify some of the participants Blackwood mentioned in his diary. One image shows 7 individuals arranged in front of a supply tent, their faces clearly visible despite the age of the photograph. Using facial recognition technology and cross-referencing with period identification documents, researchers have tentatively identified 3 of these individuals. A man matching Jonathan Reeves's passport photograph from 1926, a woman whose features align with academic records of a linguist named Dr. Sarah Pemberton, and a figure in the background who bears striking resemblance to Heinrich Vogel. These identifications, while not definitively confirmed, provide the first visual evidence corroborating Blackwood's written accounts. Another photograph from the intact rolls shows equipment that raises intriguing questions about the expedition's true capabilities. Arranged on a tarpaulin are several wooden crates with stenciled German text, coils of rope, traditional surveying instruments, and what appears to be electrical equipment highly unusual for 1,928 archaeological work. One device resembles early electromagnetic detection apparatus, with copper coils and vacuum tubes visible. If this identification is correct, it would explain the magnetic interference noted by Alexandria Customs officials and suggest the team possessed technology decades ahead of standard archaeological practice. The presence of such equipment implies they were searching for something specific, something that required detecting properties beyond what visual inspection or conventional tools could reveal. The ruined third roll presents a scientific puzzle that has defied satisfactory explanation. Hendricks initially assumed the canister had been accidentally opened during the decades in storage, but careful examination revealed the protective seals remained intact. The metal showed no corrosion or damage that might have allowed light penetration. Professional film analysts who examined the negatives confirmed the blackening resulted from exposure to energy. But the pattern was inconsistent with typical light damage. Instead of the uneven degradation expected from accidental exposure, every frame showed uniform, complete opacity, as though subjected to intense, evenly distributed radiation or electromagnetic energy while still sealed inside its protective container. Testing conducted on the film stock itself revealed anomalies that deepened the mystery. Chemical analysis detected trace amounts of elements that shouldn't be present in standard photographic emulsion from that era. Specifically, the film contained elevated levels of ionized particles consistent with exposure to high-energy electromagnetic fields. Modern imaging techniques attempting to recover any latent information from the negatives proved unsuccessful, but the attempts did reveal faint geometric patterns in the emulsion straight lines and angular shapes that appeared deliberately arranged rather than random artifacts of degradation. These patterns suggested the film had recorded something before being destroyed, and whatever that something was had possessed properties that continued affecting the emulsion even after initial exposure. The question of when and how the third roll was ruined becomes critical to understanding what it might have captured. If Blackwood documented surface activities on the first two rolls and reserved the third for underground photography, the ruined film might have been destroyed during the expedition itself. Several scenarios could explain this. Intense electromagnetic fields in the chamber they discovered, deliberate sabotage by expedition members who decided certain evidence shouldn't survive, or confiscation and irradiation by authorities who examined the film before returning it to Blackwood's possession. Each explanation suggests different conclusions about what lay beneath the Giza Plateau. Hendricks reported one additional peculiarity that has never been adequately explained. When he first opened the leather camera case in 1984, before having the film developed, his compass began spinning erratically. The effect persisted for several minutes, even when he moved the compass away from the case. After the film was removed and developed, the compass functioned normally near the empty case. Whatever had ruined the third roll of film had apparently retained enough residual energy to affect magnetic instruments more than 50 years after Blackwood's expedition, hinting at forces or materials that operated according to principles beyond conventional understanding. 1928. British military radio operators stationed in Cairo kept detailed logs of all wireless communications, a practice that continued from the Great War through the late 1922. In the logbooks for May 1928, there's a notation repeated on 6 separate dates. Unidentified transmission, bearing approximately 265 degrees, duration 3 to 7 minutes, language undetermined, signal strength variable. The bearing points directly toward the Giza Plateau. After May 29th, the notations stop, replaced by a single line entry. Interference source identified and resolved. No further action required. No explanation of the resolution was ever recorded. The transmissions first appeared on May 14th, detected during routine monitoring of military frequencies. The operators noted the signal's unusual characteristics. It occupied a bandwidth between standard commercial and military channels, using a frequency that was technically legal but rarely utilized for civilian purposes in Egypt at that time. The signal pattern didn't match any known wireless telegraph code, neither Morse nor any of the commercial variants used by shipping or aviation. Instead, operators described it as rhythmic but not repetitive, with tonal variations that suggested either a sophisticated code or, as one operator speculated in the margins of the log, possibly voice transmission using unknown modulation technique. What makes these transmissions particularly intriguing is their timing correlation with other documented events. The first detection on May 14th came just 4 days after Heinrich Vogel's last confirmed sighting travelling toward Giza. The transmission on May 17th occurred on the exact date Edmund Blackwood recorded his descent into the underground chamber. Each subsequent transmission dates align with entries in Blackwood's diary describing the expedition's activities, as if someone at Giza was broadcasting regular reports to an unknown recipient. The duration of transmissions gradually increased from 3 minutes on May 14th to 7 minutes by May 24th, suggesting either more complex information being communicated or deteriorating transmission conditions requiring longer periods to convey the same amount of data. The directional bearing proved precise enough to triangulate an approximate source location when cross-referenced with secondary monitoring stations at British facilities in Alexandria and Port Said. All 3 stations detected the same transmissions on May 21st, allowing military communication specialists to calculate the signal originated from a point within a 3-kilometre radius of the Great Pyramid. This level of precision effectively eliminated the possibility of distant sources reflected by atmospheric conditions and confirmed the transmission came from the immediate vicinity of the plateau. However, the calculated source point lay in an area with no known structures or installations capable of housing radio transmission equipment in 1928. Radio technology of the period required substantial equipment, power supplies, antenna arrays, and transmitter apparatus weighing hundreds of pounds. Setting up a clandestine broadcasting station at Giza would have necessitated transporting this equipment past authorities, establishing power generation capability, and erecting antennas conspicuous enough to be noticed by the thousands of tourists and workers who frequented the area daily. This suggests 3 possibilities. The equipment was disguised or hidden underground. The expedition possessed remarkably portable transmission technology far beyond what was commercially available, or the signals originated from a location that observers had no reason to investigate because it appeared to be ancient architecture rather than modern infrastructure. The abrupt cessation of transmissions after May 29th raises questions about what identified and resolved actually meant. The phrasing suggests active intervention rather than passive observation. Something was done to stop the transmissions. The timing coincides with the period when, according to Blackwood's diary, the expedition began experiencing internal conflict about whether to seal the chamber they'd discovered. If authorities detected and triangulated these transmissions, they would have had sufficient information to locate and confront the expedition. The fact that the transmission stopped permanently suggests either the equipment was confiscated, the expedition ceased operations, or those broadcasting decided the risk of continued transmission outweighed the benefits. Attempts to locate the original audio recordings of these transmissions, if any were made, have been unsuccessful. Standard military protocol of the period called for recording unusual signals for analysis, but the Cairo station's audio archives for May 1928 contain a suspicious gap. Recordings exist for early May and for June onward, but the critical 3-week period when the mysterious transmissions occurred is simply missing. Archive documentation indicates these recordings should exist, but the physical media wax cylinders that were standard for military radio intelligence work are not in their designated storage locations. Either they deteriorated beyond preservation, were deliberately removed, or were transferred to a classified collection that has never been made available to researchers. Dr. Marcus Reeves, a Cambridge-trained astronomer who had published papers on ancient Egyptian astronomical alignments, joined the expedition specifically to verify certain measurements within the pyramid complex. His personal letters to his wife, preserved in the Cambridge University archives, describe his growing excitement about alignments that predate the 4th dynasty by centuries, perhaps millennia. In his final letter, dated August 22nd, 1928, he wrote, "The mathematics are irrefutable, darling, but the implications are simply too extraordinary to commit to paper. I must present my findings in person." He never returned to England. Reeves's academic background made him uniquely qualified to interpret astronomical data encoded in ancient architecture. His doctoral dissertation at Cambridge had examined how the Great Pyramid's shaft alignments corresponded with stellar positions during the Old Kingdom, work that earned him recognition as one of the leading authorities on ancient Egyptian astronomical knowledge. His published papers demonstrated mastery of both modern astronomical calculation and ancient Egyptian timekeeping systems, including their observations of stellar precession. The gradual shift in the position of stars caused by Earth's axial wobble, occurring over cycles of approximately 26,000 years. This expertise suggests that whatever measurements he took at Giza involved sophisticated astronomical analysis beyond simple architectural survey work. The letters to his wife chart a progression from cautious scientific interest to profound intellectual upheaval. Early correspondence from April describes routine verification work, confirming known pyramid alignments and documenting minor measurement discrepancies. By June, his tone shifts noticeably. He writes of unexpected correlations and mentions conducting calculations that suggest construction timelines incompatible with conventional chronology. One particularly revealing passage describes spending an entire night working mathematical problems by lantern light, attempting to reconcile stellar position data with accepted dates for pyramid construction. His conclusion, carefully worded, was that either our understanding of Egyptian history requires fundamental revision, or we are witnessing evidence of astronomical knowledge that should not have existed in the 3rd millennium BCE. The phrase, "alignments that predate the 4th dynasty by centuries, perhaps millennia," represents a radical challenge to archaeological consensus. The Great Pyramid is attributed to 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu, placing its construction around 2560 BCE. If Reeves detected alignments requiring astronomical positions from significantly earlier periods, two explanations become possible. Either the structures he measured were built much earlier than accepted chronology suggests, or they incorporated astronomical data from observations made centuries before construction and preserved with remarkable precision through generations. Either scenario would revolutionize understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization's antiquity and knowledge continuity. Reeves's astronomical calculations apparently focused on stellar positions rather than solar or lunar cycles. His letters reference specific stars including Sirius, Thuban in Draco constellation, and several stars in Orion's belt, all celestial objects significant to ancient Egyptian cosmology, and featured prominently in pyramid alignment theories. However, his final letters hint at additional celestial reference points, not previously recognized in Egyptian astronomical texts. This suggests he identified alignments to stars or stellar positions that conventional Egyptology hadn't associated with pyramid design, possibly indicating knowledge of astronomical phenomena that required centuries of continuous observation to detect and record accurately. The mathematical notebooks that should have contained Reeves's detailed calculations have never been located. His wife reported that he typically carried 2 leather-bound calculation books during fieldwork, filling them with formulae, astronomical tables, and geometric proofs. These notebooks did not return with his other personal effects, which were eventually shipped to Cambridge with a note stating they represented all recoverable materials from Dr. Reeves's Egyptian residence. The absence of his working calculations means that whatever astronomical revelation it convinced him he'd made an extraordinary discovery cannot be independently verified or reconstructed from his surviving correspondence. Cambridge University's inquiry into Reeves's disappearance, conducted in late 1928, revealed troubling details about his final weeks. Hotel staff in Cairo reported that during August, Reeves had received several visitors described as Egyptian officials who spent hours in conference with him. After these meetings, colleagues noticed Reeves became increasingly withdrawn and nervous, allegedly expressing concerns that his findings might be suppressed for political reasons. One witness statement describes Reeves burning papers in his hotel room's fireplace during an uncharacteristically hot August. Evening unusual behaviour for a meticulous academic whose career depended on documented research. What information did those papers contain that Reeves deemed too dangerous or controversial to preserve? The astronomical implications, Reeves found, too extraordinary to commit to paper, have become a source of endless speculation. Some researchers suggest he discovered evidence that the Giza complex encoded astronomical data from the previous precession cycle, pushing its origins back beyond 10,000 BCE. Others propose his calculations, the revealed knowledge of celestial mechanics that ancient civilizations supposedly couldn't have possessed. Perhaps awareness of planetary motions, stellar parallax, or cosmic cycles requiring instruments and mathematical sophistication far exceeding what archaeology attributes to Bronze Age cultures. Whatever Reeves uncovered, it convinced a rigorously trained scientist that the foundations of historical understanding required complete reassessment. Geological studies conducted by Robert Schoch in the 1990 seconds suggested water erosion patterns on the Sphinx indicated it could be thousands of years older than conventionally dated. His findings were controversial, but they aligned with persistent rumours among Egyptologists that a chamber beneath the Sphinx's pores had been known to excavators in the 1920 seconds but deliberately concealed. Oral histories collected from descendants of Egyptian workers who laboured on the plateau in that era mention the room of sand that Vogel found, and describe how the foreign doctors made everyone leave and then filled it in with rocks during the night. The erosion patterns Schoch identified show characteristics consistent with water weathering rather than wind and sand abrasion. Deep vertical fissures and undulating horizontal surfaces match geological profiles created by prolonged exposure to running water and rainfall. Since Egypt's climate has been predominantly arid for the past 5,000 years, these erosion features would require the Sphinx to have been exposed during the region's last extended wet period, which ended around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. This geological evidence, if accepted, pushes the Sphinx's origins into a time period before the emergence of the dynastic Egyptian civilization that mainstream archaeology credits with its construction. The rumours of a concealed chamber beneath the Sphinx gained credibility through multiple independent accounts that emerged decades apart. French architect and Egyptologist Émile Baraïs, who conducted excavation and restoration work on the Sphinx between 1925 and 1936, made cryptic references in his field notes to anomalous spaces detected during foundation stabilization work. His official published reports make no mention of chambers or voids, but his personal correspondence contains veiled allusions to discoveries requiring consultation with authorities and areas where excavation was discontinued per administrative direction. The discrepancy between his private writings and public documentation suggests Barry's encountered something that he was either unwilling or forbidden to disclose through official channels. The oral histories provided by descendants of Egyptian workers offer specific details that are difficult to dismiss as pure folklore. Multiple accounts, collected independently by different researchers during the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, describe similar events. Foreign excavators working at night with minimal local labour, the sound of stone being moved and equipment being transported, and areas being hastily backfilled before dawn. One particularly detailed account from the grandson of a foreman describes how workers were instructed to bring limestone blocks to the Sphinx area after dark, receiving payment in British pounds rather than the usual Egyptian currency. The unusual payment method, the nighttime timing, and the use of minimal witnesses all suggest an operation intended to avoid official documentation or public awareness. The reference to the room of sand appears across multiple oral testimonies with consistent descriptive elements. Workers described a chamber accessed from below the Sphinx's pores, containing sand that was pure and fine like desert glass, and walls that were smooth, as though cut by water, not tools. Some accounts mention the chamber's unusual acoustics. Voices echoed strangely, and certain sounds seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. One testimony includes the detail that the sand appeared to have patterns or markings when disturbed, like someone had drawn in it, but the drawings were very old. These consistent elements across independent accounts suggest a shared experience rather than embellished legend. Modern scanning technology has provided tantalizing evidence that supports the chamber rumors. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted in 1991 and again in 1996, detected rectangular voids beneath and between the Sphinx's pores. The scans showed what appeared to be artificial cavities at depths of approximately 9 meters, with dimensions suggesting human construction rather than natural geological features. Egyptian authorities initially acknowledged these findings, with then Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities stating that the anomalies warranted further investigation. However, subsequent requests to conduct exploratory drilling or excavation have been consistently denied, with official explanations citing concerns about structural stability of the monument. The possibility that such a chamber was discovered in 1928 and then deliberately sealed raises profound questions about what it might have contained. If Vogel's expedition found this space, their reactions sealing it quickly and quietly rather than announcing a major archaeological discovery suggests the contents were troubling in some way. Perhaps the chamber contained artifacts or inscriptions that contradicted established historical narratives. Perhaps it showed evidence of technological sophistication inappropriate for the supposed time period. Or perhaps it was simply empty, but its existence and construction method proved the Sphinx was far older than officially accepted, with implications that authorities in the 1,920 seconds decided were too destabilizing to acknowledge. The sand itself, described as unusually pure and fine, may hold clues to the chamber's purpose. Several ancient cultures used sand in acoustic and resonance experiments, understanding that different grain sizes and purity levels affect sound transmission. If the chamber was intentionally filled with specific sand, it might have functioned as some form of resonance chamber or sound-based technology. The descriptions of unusual acoustic properties, selective sound absorption, and strange echoes align with principles of acoustic engineering that modern science has only recently begun to understand in archaeological contexts, such as the resonance frequencies detected in megalithic chambers throughout Europe and the Americas. Customs records from Alexandria Port show that Dr. Vogel's 4 crates of surveying equipment were indeed offloaded from the SS Merkur in March 1928, but there's no corresponding record of them passing through Cairo customs, despite Cairo being the only practical route to Giza. Even more peculiar, shipping manifests from September of that year list 6 crates addressed to the Berlin Archaeological Institute, departing from Alexandria, registered under the name of a German trading company that dissolved in 1927. The crate's contents were listed as geological samples with a combined weight of approximately 800 kilograms, far heavier than the equipment that had arrived 6 months earlier. The gap in the customs trail between Alexandria and Cairo represents either catastrophic record-keeping failure or deliberate circumvention of official channels. Egyptian customs bureaucracy in the 1,920 was notoriously meticulous, a legacy of British colonial administration that insisted on documented accountability for all goods moving through the territory. The absence of Cairo customs records for Vogel's crates suggests they travelled via unofficial routes, possibly with the assistance of individuals who possessed sufficient authority or influence to bypass standard inspection procedures. This level of facilitation would have required coordination with customs officials, transport personnel, and likely military or police contacts who could ensure the cargo moved unobserved through checkpoints. The transformation from 4 arriving crates to 6 departing ones raises immediate questions about what the expedition acquired during their time at Giza. Simple mathematical calculation shows the outbound shipment contained approximately 400 kilograms more material than arrived. Geological samples could plausibly explain this weight difference if the expedition collected substantial quantities of stone, mineral specimens, or artifact fragments. However, archaeological expeditions of that era typically removed artifacts weighing dozens of kilograms, not hundreds. The sheer mass of the outbound shipment suggests either the removal of large architectural elements, the extraction of unusually dense materials, or the discovery of numerous objects that the expedition deemed significant enough to risk illegally exporting from Egypt. The use of a defunct trading company's name for the shipping registration reveals sophisticated attempt to obscure the cargo's true origins and destination. By 1928, the German trading company listed on the manifest had been officially dissolved for over a year, its business registration cancelled, and its commercial activities ceased. Someone deliberately chose a non-existent entity to process the shipment, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to trace, while still appearing superficially legitimate to shipping clerks who wouldn't verify corporate registration status. This level of logistical deception indicates planning and resources beyond what a typical archaeological expedition would possess or require, suggesting involvement of parties with experience in covert transport operations. The crates never arrived at the Berlin Archaeological Institute, or if they did, no record of their receipt exists in the Institute's acquisition logs. Standard protocol required documenting all incoming materials, particularly those classified as geological or archaeological specimens. The Institute's archives for 1928 and 1929 contain no reference to Egyptian geological samples, no accessioning records for crates from Alexandria, and no correspondence acknowledging receipt of materials from Vogel's expedition. This absence becomes even more significant, considering that archaeological institutions jealously documented their acquisitions, as these materials represented both scientific value and institutional prestige. The crates simply vanished somewhere between Alexandria port and their supposed destination in Berlin. Shipping route analysis suggests several possible diversion points. The manifest indicates the crates were loaded onto the SS Brandenburg, a German merchant vessel that made regular runs between Alexandria and Hamburg, with stops at various Mediterranean and European ports. Cargo loaded at Alexandria could theoretically be offloaded at any of these intermediate stops without arousing suspicion, provided proper documentation was presented to port authorities. Marseille, Genoa, and Gibraltar all represented potential diversion points where the crates could have been transferred to other vessels or transported overland to undisclosed locations. Without detailed port-by-port cargo verification, which was rarely conducted for routine commercial shipments, the crates could have disappeared at any point along this route. The classification of contents as geological samples rather than archaeological artifacts carries legal implications that may explain the deliberate mislabeling. Egyptian antiquities law in 1928 required permits for removing archaeological materials and granted the Egyptian government first right of refusal on significant discoveries. Geological samples faced fewer restrictions, particularly if they were claimed to be for scientific analysis rather than museum collection. By classifying their cargo as geological rather than archaeological, the expedition created legal ambiguity that would complicate any attempt to challenge the export or demand the material's return. This suggests whoever organized the shipment understood Egyptian cultural property law and intentionally structured the documentation to exploit regulatory loopholes. In 2003, an Egyptian historian named Dr. Ahmed Fathi conducted oral history interviews with elderly residents of the villages surrounding Giza, recording stories passed down from their grandparents who had worked on archaeological digs in the 1,920 seconds. Several interviewees independently recounted a story about the dig that made no sound, describing how foreign archaeologists hired local workers to move stone and earth but did all the actual excavation work, and themselves, in silence, during the night. Workers reported being paid unusually well but warned never to speak about what they had seen. Those who violated this agreement, the stories claimed, found themselves unable to secure work anywhere on the plateau again. The phrase, "the dig that made no sound," appears to be more than metaphorical. Multiple accounts describe excavation work conducted with unusual secrecy, where even the typical sounds of archaeological labour, hammering, conversations, instructions being called between workers, were deliberately suppressed. Some testimonies mention foreigners using hand signals rather than verbal communication, working by shielded lantern light that was kept deliberately dim, and organising labour in small, isolated groups who were kept separated from one another. This operational security suggests the expedition was acutely aware they were conducting unauthorised or sensitive work that would attract unwanted attention if discovered. The compensation pattern corroborates claims of unusual circumstances. Standard wages for archaeological labourers on the Giza Plateau in the late 1,920 seconds ranged from 10 to 15 piastres per day. The silent dig workers reported receiving payments of 50 piastres or more, 3 to 5 times the normal rate, and being paid in British pounds or gold rather than local currency. Such generous compensation would ensure loyalty and discretion, making the financial loss of speaking out far greater than any potential benefit. Several accounts mention workers receiving bonus payments at the conclusion of work, contingent upon maintaining silence, effectively creating economic incentives for long-term confidentiality. The enforcement of silence went beyond financial incentives into active suppression. Families described relatives who, after speaking carelessly about their work, suddenly found themselves blacklisted from employment opportunities throughout the plateau. The reach of this blacklisting system was remarkably comprehensive. It affected not just archaeological sites, but also tourist services, construction projects, and even agricultural work on properties owned by foreigners. This level of coordinated economic punishment required an organised network with substantial influence over local hiring practices, suggesting either government involvement or a well-connected private organisation capable of pressuring multiple employers simultaneously. Dr. Fathi's documentation revealed consistent details across geographically separated testimonies. Interviewees from villages on opposite sides of the plateau, who had no known family connections or reasons to coordinate their stories, described similar experiences with the silent dig. They mentioned the same time frame, spring and summer of 1,928, the same unusual payment methods, and the same atmosphere of secrecy and tension. This consistency across independent sources strongly suggests the accounts reflect genuine historical events rather than elaborated folklore or coordinated fabrication. The psychological impact on workers persisted across generations. Several interviewees described how their grandparents, even decades after the events, remained reluctant to discuss the dig in detail, displaying visible anxiety when the topic arose. One testimony described a grandfather who, on his deathbed in 1965, finally spoke more freely about what he'd witnessed, mentioning chambers that shouldn't be there, and things that were older than the pharaohs. These deathbed confessions, shared when the fear of economic retaliation had finally lost its power, suggests that what workers witnessed genuinely disturbed them, and that the enforced silence created lasting psychological burdens they carried throughout their lives. When researchers from the University of Munich attempted to investigate Dr. Heinrich Vogel's employment history in 1977, the Berlin Archaeological Institute provided a formal statement. No one by that name had ever been employed by the institution in any capacity. They suggested the name might be an alias, or that the person in question had falsely claimed institutional affiliation, yet a photograph published in the Berlin Archaeological Society's 1927 newsletter clearly shows Dr. H. Vogel presenting a paper on subsurface imaging techniques, and the accompanying article references his decade of distinguished service to the Institute. The contradiction between photographic evidence and institutional denial creates an impossible situation where documented proof conflicts with official records. The 1927 newsletter photograph shows Vogel standing at a lectern with the Institute's emblem visible on the wall behind him, presenting to an audience of recognizable German archaeologists whose identities and affiliations are well established. The accompanying article provides specific details about his presentation on electromagnetic detection methods for locating buried structures, describes his previous fieldwork in Turkey and Greece, and mentions his role as senior researcher in the Institute's Geophysical Survey Division. This level of detail in a professional publication makes casual misidentification or fraudulent claims virtually impossible. Further complicating the Institute's denial are references to Vogel in contemporary academic correspondence. Letters housed in various European archaeological archives mention consulting with Vogel on technical matters, cite his unpublished research, and acknowledge his contributions to ongoing projects. A 1926 letter from British archaeologist Leonard Woolley mentions discussing ground-penetrating techniques with Heinrich Vogel of Berlin, referring to him as an established authority on subsurface detection. Methods. These scattered references across multiple independent archives create a documentary web that would be extraordinarily difficult to fabricate, but equally difficult for the Institute to have completely erased. The Institute's institutional memory appears to have been selectively edited. Employment rosters, payroll records, and personnel files that should document Vogel's decade of service simply don't exist in the archives. Building access logs, project assignment records, and publication credit lists, all the routine administrative paperwork that accumulates around any long-term employee, have been systematically removed or were never created. This comprehensive absence of documentation required either extraordinary thoroughness in record destruction or the retroactive creation of a false historical record that excluded Vogel while maintaining consistency across hundreds of related documents. The timing of the Institute's formal denial in 1977 coincides with increased international interest in the 1928 Egyptian expedition and growing academic inquiry into archaeological mysteries from the colonial period. By the 1972, researchers equipped with new investigative tools and access to previously sealed archives were beginning to piece together evidence of covert expeditions and suppressed discoveries. The Institute's categorical denial, rather than acknowledging uncertainty or incomplete records, suggests institutional policy to actively discourage investigation rather than simply claiming ignorance about personnel from 50 years prior. A possible explanation for the Institute's position lies in the political turbulence Germany experienced between the 1922 and 1972. The Institute's archives suffered damage during World War II bombing raids, were partially seized by Soviet forces in 1945, and underwent reorganization during Germany's division and eventual reunification. These disruptions could plausibly explain missing employment records. However, the survival of the 927 newsletter photograph. While personnel files vanished, suggest selective preservation or destruction. Some materials were carefully maintained, while others specifically related to Vogel were systematically removed. This pattern indicates intentional historical revision rather than random wartime losses. Edmund Blackwood was known for his meticulous surveying work, having previously mapped archaeological sites in Mesopotamia and Palestine with exceptional accuracy. Among his papers was a partial map of the Giza Plateau, dated June 1928, drawn in his characteristic precise hand, showing the three main pyramids and the Sphinx in their correct positions. However, beneath the Sphinx, his map includes a detailed diagram of a chamber system extending some 50 meters underground, with annotations in the margin reading, "Confirmed by percussion test," and entrance sealed with original masonry. Weight 40+ tons. Modern architectural surveys of the Sphinx have detected anomalies in roughly the same location his map indicates. The technical precision of Blackwood's underground mapping raises questions about how he obtained such detailed information about spaces supposedly inaccessible. Percussion testing, the method he references, involves striking surfaces and analyzing the resulting sound waves to detect hollow spaces behind solid material. This technique requires sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles and considerable practical experience to interpret correctly. The fact that Blackwood's annotations specifically mention "confirmed by percussion test" suggests he conducted multiple verification measurements, lending scientific rigor to his documentation of chambers that officially don't exist. The chamber system diagram shows a main rectangular space, measuring approximately 14 by 9 meters, with 3 smaller adjoining rooms and what appears to be a descending passage. Blackwood's drawing includes structural details such as wall thickness measurements, ceiling height estimates, and notations about construction materials. Limestone blocks for walls, granite for certain architectural elements. The level of architectural specificity indicates he either gained physical access to these spaces or obtained information from someone who had. The measurements are too precise and internally consistent to represent speculation or interpretation of indirect evidence alone. His notation about original masonry, est, weight 40+ tons, blocking an entrance reveals several important details. First, it confirms Blackwood believed the entrance had been deliberately sealed in antiquity, not recently by the 1928 expedition. Second, the weight estimate suggests he carefully calculated or measured the blocking stone's dimensions and density. Third, the phrase original masonry implies the ceiling stones matched the surrounding ancient construction in material and technique, making the closure nearly indistinguishable from the monument's original architecture. The correspondence between Blackwood's 1928 map and modern geophysical surveys provides striking validation. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic studies conducted in the 1992 and 2000s detected rectangular voids beneath the Sphinx, in locations that align closely with Blackwood's hand-drawn diagram. The dimensions of detected anomalies, approximately 12 to 15 meters in length, fall within the range Blackwood indicated. This correlation across 70 years and completely different detection methodologies strongly suggests Blackwood mapped genuine underground structures rather than creating fictional chambers. Blackwood's map includes coordinate notations using the triangulation system standard for archaeological surveying in the 1922, referencing fixed points on the pyramid complex to establish precise locations. These coordinates can be converted to modern GPS positioning, allowing contemporary researchers to identify exact locations Blackwood documented. Several investigative attempts to conduct limited excavation or drilling at these coordinates have been blocked by Egyptian authorities, typically with explanations citing structural concerns about the Sphinx's stability. The consistent refusal to investigate areas specifically indicated on Blackwood's map suggests authorities may possess knowledge corroborating the chamber system's existence. The map's margins contain additional cryptic notations that hint at the chamber's contents or purpose. Phrases like acoustic properties unusual and alignment 26 degrees celestial suggest Blackwood observed or theorized about the space's functions. The acoustic reference aligns with oral histories describing chambers with strange sound properties, while the alignment notation connects to astronomical theories about the Giza complex encoding celestial knowledge. These fragmentary observations indicate Blackwood attempted to understand not just the chamber's physical characteristics, but their intended purpose within the broader architectural and symbolic system of the plateau. That wasn't. British Foreign Office documents from late 1928, recently declassified, contain a curious exchange of cables between Cairo and London regarding the German situation at Giza. The cables reference unauthorized excavation activities, possible antiquities, smuggling, and diplomatic complications requiring immediate resolution. However, the expected follow-up reports, formal complaints, or investigation summaries are entirely absent from the file. Instead, there's a single typed note dated October 15th, 1928, stating only, "Matter resolved through alternative channels, all parties satisfied. File may be closed." The initial cable traffic reveals genuine concern at multiple levels of British colonial administration. A message dated September 3rd from the High Commissioner's office in Cairo describes reports of German nationals conducting excavation work without proper authorization from the Antiquities Service. A follow-up, cable 3 days later, escalates the matter, mentioning concerns raised by Egyptian officials regarding removal of materials from protected archaeological sites. The language suggests this was not a minor bureaucratic irregularity, but a situation serious enough to bland, involve senior diplomatic personnel, and potentially strain Anglo-German relations during a period when European powers were carefully managing post-war tensions. What makes these cables particularly revealing is their specific terminology. The phrase unauthorized excavation activities appears in quotation marks in one message, suggesting officials were repeating language used by informants or witnesses, rather than making direct observations. References to possible antiquities smuggling indicate suspicions about illegal export of archaeological materials, a charge that would normally trigger formal investigation, customs reviews, and potentially criminal proceedings. The fact that such serious allegations appear in diplomatic correspondence but never resulted in official investigation reports suggests powerful intervention prevented the matter from following normal administrative and legal channels. The mention of diplomatic complications hints at tensions beyond simple permit violations. If the incident involved only German archaeologists working without proper authorization, standard protocols would involve notifying German diplomatic representatives, issuing formal complaints through official channels, and allowing routine bureaucratic processes to address the violation. The elevation to diplomatic complications suggests entanglements involving multiple national interests, possibly classified information, or circumstances that couldn't be resolved through conventional diplomatic mechanisms without creating international tensions or unwanted publicity. The resolution through alternative channels represents the most significant mystery in these documents. Diplomatic correspondence typically follows established protocols with documented decision-making chains and official communications. Alternative channels suggests involvement of parties or mechanisms operating outside standard diplomatic frameworks, possibly intelligence services, informal agreements between officials, or interventions by organizations with influence across multiple governments. The phrase implies arrangements made quietly, without formal documentation, specifically to keep the matter out of official records that would eventually become accessible to historians and researchers. The notation that all parties satisfied suggests negotiated settlement rather than enforcement of regulations or punishment of violations. If German nationals had genuinely committed serious infractions involving unauthorized excavation and smuggling, satisfaction would typically mean prosecution, deportation, or at minimum formal diplomatic protest. Instead, this phrase implies compromise, where various interested parties, British authorities, German officials, Egyptian administrators, and possibly others, reached an accommodation that each found acceptable. Such multi-party satisfaction in response to alleged criminal activity suggests the situation involved complexities or sensitivities that made conventional legal resolution undesirable for everyone involved. The abrupt file closure on October 15th comes just 6 weeks after the initial cables expressing serious concern. This rapid resolution of what appeared to be a significant diplomatic and legal matter stands in stark contrast to typical bureaucratic timelines, where investigations of international incidents involving archaeological violations would normally extend over months. The speed suggests either pre-existing arrangements that simply needed activation or urgent pressure from authorities, who wanted the matter concluded quickly before it attracted broader attention or generated documentation that would prove problematic in the future. French archaeologist Émile Baraïs kept detailed daily journals throughout his 40-year career in Egypt, documenting every dig, every discovery, every conversation with colleagues. His journals from 1926, 1927, and 1929 are preserved in the archives of the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, each running to hundreds of pages of dense, handwritten notes. The journal for 1928 is listed in the catalogue, but marked missing since 1962. A secretary who worked in the archives during that period, interviewed shortly before her death in 1998, claimed the journal hadn't gone missing at all. It was removed on orders from the ministry. I saw the authorization myself. They took it and 4 other items, all related to that German expedition everyone pretended hadn't happened. Baraïs occupied a unique position within Egyptian archaeology during the 1922. As chief architect for the Antiquities Service, he oversaw restoration projects throughout the country and maintained professional relationships with virtually every foreign archaeological team operating in Egypt. His journals served as comprehensive records of archaeological activity during a formative period in Egyptology, documenting not just his own work but observations about other expeditions, informal conversations with colleagues, and administrative decisions affecting archaeological research. The 1928 journal would have captured his observations during the exact period when Vogel's expedition was active at Giza. The secretary's testimony provides rare first-hand evidence of official confiscation rather than accidental loss. Her account specifies seeing written authorization from the ministry, presumably the Ministry of Culture, or a predecessor organization, indicating this was not unauthorized theft but sanctioned removal of materials deemed sensitive. The fact that she remembered this event clearly decades later, despite processing countless archive transactions during her career, suggests the confiscation was unusual enough to leave a lasting impression. Her mention of 4 other items indicates the 1928 journal was part of a targeted retrieval of materials specifically connected to Vogel's expedition. The timing of the 1962 confiscation carries potential significance. By the early 1962s, Egypt had undergone revolutionary political transformation. Under Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal and was asserting greater control over its cultural heritage and historical narrative. The government was systematically reviewing archaeological records and restricting foreign access to sensitive sites and information. Confiscating Baraïs's 1928 journal during this period suggests authorities conducting comprehensive inventory of documentation related to colonial-era excavations discovered materials they deemed necessary to remove from public access. What information might Barries's journal have contained that warranted confiscation 3 decades after the events it documented? As chief architect overseeing the Sphinx and Pyramid complex, Barries would have been notified of any official excavation permits, would have observed unusual activity on the plateau, and would have heard gossip and rumours circulating among the archaeological community. His journal entries might have documented conversations with Vogel or other expedition members, described his own observations of their activities, recorded official or unofficial complaints about unauthorized digging, or noted administrative decisions to suppress information about discoveries. The secretary's phrase, "everyone pretended hadn't happened," encapsulates the conspiracy of silence surrounding the 1,928 expedition. By the 1,962nd, when she made this observation, the collective amnesia had become so complete that discussing Vogel's expedition had become taboo within Egyptian archaeological circles. The fact that she explicitly connected the confiscated materials to that German expedition indicates this connection was openly acknowledged by officials authorizing the removal, even while publicly the expedition's existence was denied. The fate of Barries's journal and the 4 other confiscated items remains unknown. They could reside in restricted government archives, accessible only to officials with appropriate clearance. They might have been destroyed to permanently eliminate their contents from the historical record, or they could have been transferred to intelligence or security services, classified as matters of national security rather than archaeological interest. Without access to ministry records detailing what was taken and why, researchers can only speculate about what Barries documented, and why authorities decided those documents were too sensitive to remain in public archives. 17. The stonework that predates dynasties. In his diary, Edmund Blackwood describes the masonry in the chamber they discovered as unlike any dynastic work, lacking the tool marks one expects from copper or bronze implements. He notes that the blocks fit together with tolerances, reminiscent of the Valley Temple but executed with even greater precision, and speculates they might have been shaped by methods unknown to current historical understanding. Modern analysis of pre-dynastic Egyptian stonework has identified several sites where the construction techniques seem anomalously advanced, leading some researchers to propose the existence of a sophisticated culture that predated the pharaohs. Though such theories remain firmly outside mainstream Egyptology, Blackwood's observations about missing tool marks represent more than aesthetic commentary. They constitute technical analysis from a trained surveyor familiar with ancient construction methods. Copper and bronze tools, the implements available to dynastic Egyptian builders, leave characteristic scratches, striations, and percussion marks on stone surfaces. These traces remain visible even on structures thousands of years old, providing archaeologists with evidence about construction techniques and technological capabilities. The absence of such marks on chamber walls would indicate either the use of different, harder tools or non-mechanical shaping methods that conventional archaeology struggles to explain within the context of Bronze Age technology. The reference to the Valley Temple provides crucial context for understanding what impressed Blackwood. The Valley Temple at Giza, associated with the Second Pyramid, features massive limestone and granite blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision. Some joints between stones are so tight that modern researchers have difficulty inserting paper between them. This construction quality has long puzzled archaeologists because it surpasses the precision found in most other dynastic structures. For Blackwood to claim the chamber masonry exceeded even Valley Temple standards suggests construction quality that pushes beyond the technical capabilities conventionally attributed to ancient Egyptian civilization. Modern researchers examining pre-dynastic sites have identified similar anomalies that support Blackwood's observations. The Osirayun at Abydos, though officially dated to the 19th dynasty, features construction techniques more closely resembling the most ancient Giza structures than contemporary New Kingdom architecture. Its massive, precisely fitted blocks lack mortar and show minimal tool marks, leading some researchers to propose it might incorporate foundations from a much earlier period. Similarly, certain structures at the temple complex of Luxor display lower courses built with techniques distinctly different from upper sections, suggesting construction across vastly different time periods with varying technological capabilities. The concept of a sophisticated pre-dynastic culture remains controversial because it challenges the established narrative of civilization's linear development. Mainstream Egyptology positions the First Dynasty around 3100 BCE as the beginning of advanced Egyptian civilization, with earlier periods characterized as gradually developing agricultural societies with simple tools and limited organizational capacity. Evidence of advanced stoneworking predating this period would require rethinking fundamental assumptions about how civilizations emerge, develop technological capabilities, and preserve knowledge across generations. Geological and weathering analysis provides additional support for the existence of older structures. Robert Schoch's study of Sphinx erosion patterns, combined with similar analysis of other Giza plateau structures, suggests certain elements experienced weathering consistent with exposure during Egypt's last wet climatic period, which ended around 10,000 years ago. If accurate, this geological evidence indicates construction during a time when, according to conventional chronology, the region was inhabited only by hunter-gatherer populations, supposedly lacking the organization and technology for monumental architecture. The precision Blackwood documented would require not just advanced tools but sophisticated understanding of geometry, engineering principles, and material properties. Fitting massive stone blocks together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters demands accurate measurement systems, quality control processes, and construction planning capabilities that imply systematic technical knowledge, not accidental achievement. If such precision appears in structures predating known dynastic culture, it suggests either knowledge, inheritance from an even earlier advanced civilization, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the timeline during which human technological capabilities developed. Every major discovery around Giza comes with its share of curse stories, most of them sensationalized by newspapers eager to capitalize on Tutankhamun's legacy. But the curse said to protect the chamber found by Vogel's expedition was different. It wasn't about death or misfortune for those who disturbed the tombs, but about madness that came from knowing what the chamber contained. Dr. Fathi's oral history project recorded an elderly man who claimed his grandfather had been hired by the expedition. He would wake screaming about stars that weren't stars, about maps that showed lands beneath the sand, about builders who came before the floods. The doctors said his mind had broken from sun and fever, but he was never the same. The psychological rather than physical nature of this curse distinguishes it from typical tomb violation narratives. Traditional curse stories involve death, illness, or material misfortune befalling those who disturbed sacred spaces. Consequences that could be explained through natural causes like pathogens, accidents, or coincidental timing. The madness described in connection with Vogel's chamber suggests something more subtle and disturbing. That exposure to certain knowledge or experiences within the chamber fundamentally altered mental states in ways that persisted long after the initial encounter. This type of psychological trauma implies witnessing or learning something so incompatible with existing worldviews that the mind struggled to integrate the information. The specific content of the grandfather's nightmares provides intriguing details about what the chamber might have contained. Stars that weren't stars could reference astronomical charts or inscriptions depicting celestial objects unknown to ancient Egyptian astronomy, or perhaps representations of phenomena modern understanding would classify differently than ancient observers. Maps that showed lands beneath the sand suggests cartographic information depicting geography that no longer exists above ground. Either subterranean structures lost civilizations buried by time, or coastlines and landscapes from periods when Egypt's terrain differed dramatically from its current desert state due to climate change or geological events. The phrase "builders who came before the floods" carries profound implications for chronology and mythology. Flood narratives appear across numerous ancient cultures, from Mesopotamian epics to biblical accounts and Greek legends. If the chamber contained evidence of civilizations predating catastrophic flooding events, it would push human architectural achievement back beyond currently accepted timelines and potentially validate mythological traditions dismissed as mere storytelling. The grandfather's trauma might have resulted from confronting evidence that civilizations with advanced capabilities existed and were destroyed during prehistoric cataclysms, fundamentally challenging assumptions about humanity's technological and cultural development. The medical dismissal of his condition as sun exposure and fever represents the typical response of rational Western medicine to experiences that don't fit conventional explanatory frameworks. Doctors in the 1922 had limited understanding of psychological trauma and no framework for processing claims about ancient knowledge or anomalous discoveries. Attributing his symptoms to physical causes, heat, exhaustion, dehydration, infectious disease allowed medical practitioners to provide diagnosis and treatment within their expertise, while avoiding confronting the possibility that his mental distress stemmed from genuine encounters with disturbing information, rather than physiological illness. The permanence of his psychological change, "he was never the same," suggests deep trauma rather than temporary confusion or illness. People recovering from fever-induced delirium or heat stroke typically regain their normal mental state once physical health improves. Lasting personality changes, persistent disturbed sleep, and ongoing preoccupation with specific themes indicate unresolved psychological conflict or exposure to genuinely destabilizing experiences. His family's observation that he fundamentally changed after working on the expedition implies the experience violated his understanding of reality in ways he couldn't reconcile, leaving him caught between what he'd witnessed and what society told him was possible. Similar patterns of psychological disturbance appear in accounts from other expedition members. While direct evidence is fragmentary, references in correspondence and administrative records hint at mental health struggles among participants. One document mentions an expedition member being treated at a Cairo hospital for nervous exhaustion. Another references a team member who returned to Europe but did not resume professional activities. These scattered indications suggest the expedition's psychological toll extended beyond a single worker, affecting multiple individuals who descended into the chamber or learned about its contents. The consistency of psychological impact across different participants strengthens the argument that they encountered something genuinely disturbing rather than simply succumbing to environmental stresses or workplace accidents. Marcus Reeves had been working on a comprehensive study of astronomical alignments in ancient Egyptian architecture, hoping to prove that the pyramid's arrangement corresponded to specific stellar configurations. Among his papers, never formally published, were calculations suggesting that the Giza complex aligned not with the stars as they appeared in 2500 BC, but as they would have appeared approximately 10,500 BC. His notes indicate he found corroborating evidence in the chamber beneath the Sphinx, specifically architectural elements that track precession cycles visible only over multiple thousands of years. Modern archaeoastronomy has largely dismissed such deep time alignments as coincidental. The 10,500 BC date carries specific astronomical significance related to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over approximately 26,000-year cycles. Reeves's calculations apparently demonstrated that certain architectural features at Giza aligned precisely with stellar positions from this remote period. This date corresponds to the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. a time of dramatic climate change when Egypt's climate transitioned from wetter conditions to increasing aridity. Positioning monumental architecture to this era would require completely reconsidering the timeline of human civilization's development. The concept of tracking precession cycles across thousands of years demands sophisticated astronomical knowledge and multi-generational observation programs. Precession causes stars to shift position at a rate of roughly 1 degree every 72 years. Earlier, if architectural elements at Giza encoded awareness of precession operating over multiple thousands of years, it would indicate either continuous astronomical observation, spanning millennia, or inheritance of knowledge from civilizations that conducted such long-term observations. Either scenario challenges conventional understanding of ancient capabilities. Reeves's reference to finding corroborating evidence in the chamber beneath the Sphinx suggests the underground space contained more than empty rooms. The phrase, architectural elements that track precession cycles, implies physical features, perhaps alignments, inscriptions, or structural arrangements that demonstrated awareness of this astronomical phenomenon. These elements might have included shaft orientations that aligned with specific stellar positions only visible during ancient epochs, inscriptions depicting star positions inconsistent with dynastic-era astronomy, or measurement systems based on celestial cycles requiring thousands of years of observation to detect and calculate. Modern archaeoastronomy's dismissal of deep-time alignments as coincidental reflects methodological conservatism and the challenge of distinguishing intentional alignment from chance correlation. When analyzing ancient structures, researchers can identify numerous potential astronomical alignments simply due to the abundance of celestial objects and architectural features. Statistical analysis requires determining whether observed alignments occur more frequently than random chance would predict. Critics argue that selecting specific historical dates like 10,500 BC and then finding alignments that fit constitutes confirmation bias. Choosing conclusions first and then finding supporting data. However, this criticism loses force if multiple independent architectural features all align to the same historical period, suggesting systematic rather than coincidental correspondence. The controversy surrounding Reeves's work stems partly from its implications for historical chronology. Accepting that Giza architecture encodes astronomical observations from 10,500 BC requires one of several uncomfortable conclusions. Either the structures were built during that period by unknown civilizations possessing advanced capabilities, or they were built later but deliberately encoded ancient astronomical data preserved across thousands of years, or the alignments genuinely are coincidental, despite their apparent precision. Each explanation challenges fundamental assumptions, the first about when advanced architecture emerged, the second about knowledge transmission across pre-literate societies, the third about the statistical likelihood of multiple precise alignments occurring by chance. Reeves's decision not to formally publish these calculations might reflect his own uncertainty about their implications or concern about professional reputation. Publishing radical chronological theories based on astronomical alignments would have invited severe criticism from mainstream Egyptology and potentially damaged his academic standing. His final letter mentioning findings too extraordinary to commit to paper suggests he recognized the explosive nature of his conclusions and chose to present them in person where context and detailed explanation might make them more credible. His disappearance before completing that presentation left his most significant work unpublished and undefended against inevitable skepticism. In 1931, 3 years after the expedition's disappearance, a Turkish antiquities dealer in Istanbul attempted to sell a collection of items he claimed came from a private German acquisition in Egypt. The collection included several unusual artifacts, stone tablets, covered in symbols that resembled hieroglyphics but didn't match any known Egyptian script, metallic objects of uncertain composition, and most intriguingly, a small sealed container made of lead with warning symbols embossed on its surface. Before Turkish authorities could investigate, the dealer's shop burned to the ground and the man himself vanished. The sole surviving photograph of the collection shows items that, according to several experts, shouldn't exist based on our understanding of ancient Egyptian metallurgy. Istanbul, in the early 1930s, served as a major hub for the illicit antiquities trade, positioned strategically between European collectors and archaeological sites throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Turkish dealers operated with relative freedom during this period, as regulations governing cultural property were less stringent than modern standards. The dealer's claim of private German acquisition in Egypt provided plausible provenance that wouldn't immediately trigger legal complications, while subtly hinting at origins connected to archaeological work rather than tomb robbery. This phrasing suggests the dealer possessed enough information about the item's history to craft a cover story that would appeal to collectors while avoiding explicit admission of illegal export. The stone tablets with unrecognizable script represent the most archaeologically significant items in the collection. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing underwent evolution across 3,000 years, with variations including hieratic and demotic scripts for everyday use alongside formal hieroglyphics for monumental inscriptions. Egyptologists have catalogued these variations extensively, creating comprehensive databases of symbols and their meanings across different periods. For tablets to display symbols resembling hieroglyphics while matching no known script suggests either forgery, an undiscovered writing system, or inscriptions from a period or culture not yet recognized by academic archaeology. The fact that experts describe them as resembling hieroglyphics indicates structural similarities, pictographic characters, directional writing conventions, while containing fundamentally different symbol sets. The metallic object's uncertain composition raises questions about ancient metallurgical capabilities. Egyptian metalworking during the dynastic period utilized copper, bronze, gold, silver, and limited amounts of iron, primarily from meteoritic sources. Chemical analysis can typically identify these metals and their alloy compositions with precision. Objects whose composition experts found difficult to determine suggest either sophisticated alloys beyond documented ancient Egyptian capabilities, or metals that ancient Egyptian smiths theoretically shouldn't have been able to produce or obtain. Some researchers have speculated about advanced metallurgical knowledge in ancient cultures, including techniques for creating corrosion-resistant alloys or working with materials requiring high-temperature furnaces beyond what archaeological evidence documents. The lead container, with warning symbols embossed on its surface, evokes immediate parallels with modern hazardous material storage practices. Lead provides effective shielding against radiation and was used historically to contain dangerous substances. The presence of warning symbols suggests whoever created the container wanted to communicate danger to future observers, raising questions about what substance required such careful containment. Warning iconography implies sophisticated understanding of both the contained material's properties and the need for long-term communication across potential language barriers. The container's sealed condition indicates it was intended for long-term storage rather than frequent access. The convenient destruction of evidence through fire and the dealer's disappearance follow a pattern seen repeatedly in the Vogel expedition story. Just as investigation approaches critical evidence, that evidence vanishes through circumstances that could be interpreted as either unfortunate coincidence or deliberate elimination. The timing authorities showing interest immediately before the fire suggests either remarkable bad luck or intervention by parties monitoring the situation, who acted preemptively to prevent official examination of the artifacts. The complete disappearance of the dealer adds another layer of suspicious circumstances, transforming a potentially explainable accidental fire into a pattern suggesting organized suppression of evidence. The Egyptian Antiquities Service, established in 1858, has always maintained strict protocols for cataloguing discoveries and preserving documentation. Yet former employees, speaking confidentially to researchers over the years, have described an informal practice called Category 0 filing, where certain discoveries deemed problematic would be documented separately and stored in restricted archives. Access required special permission from the Director General, and the very existence of these files was never officially acknowledged. A Category 0 designation could be applied to artifacts that contradicted established chronology, that suggested foreign cultural influence in pre-dynastic times, or that raised questions better left unaddressed for the sake of Egyptian national heritage. The motivation behind Category 0 filing reflects tension between archaeological discovery and national identity construction. Egypt's modern sense of cultural heritage relies heavily on narratives of indigenous civilization, development, portraying ancient Egypt as a homegrown achievement emerging from the Nile Valley without significant external influence. Discoveries suggesting foreign cultural contact during formative periods, advanced technologies appearing before they supposedly developed, or chronologies that don't align with established historical frameworks could undermine these carefully constructed narratives. Rather than publicly debating such findings and potentially destabilizing accepted history, administrators apparently chose to quietly sequester problematic materials while publicly maintaining consensus narratives. The restriction of access to the Director General level indicates institutional awareness that these materials required protection from routine research access. Standard archaeological archives operate on principles of scholarly openness, allowing qualified researchers to examine materials for study and publication. Creating a separate category, requiring highest-level approval, functionally removes materials from the research ecosystem while technically preserving them. This approach allows institutions to claim they've preserved all discoveries while practically ensuring controversial items remain unexamined and unpublished. The permission requirement also creates accountability. Any researcher accessing Category 0 materials would be documented, allowing administrators to monitor who knew about problematic discoveries. Former employees' willingness to describe this system only confidentially reveals the institutional pressure surrounding Category 0 materials. Speaking publicly about restricted archives could jeopardize careers, security clearances, and professional relationships. The fact that multiple former employees independently described similar practices to different researchers suggests the system was widespread and well understood within the organization, even if never formally documented. These whistleblower accounts provide rare glimpses into institutional practices designed to remain invisible to outside observers and the broader academic community. The criteria for Category 0 designation, contradicting established chronology, suggesting foreign influence, or raising unaddressed questions, encompass precisely the types of discoveries associated with Vogel's expedition. Artifacts from chambers predating accepted pyramid construction dates would contradict chronology. Underground architecture beneath the Sphinx that couldn't be explained within conventional frameworks would certainly raise uncomfortable questions. If Vogel's team discovered and documented such materials, Category 0 filing would provide a mechanism for removing them from public knowledge while avoiding the complete destruction of potentially valuable archaeological evidence. The phrase, "for the sake of Egyptian national heritage," reveals how archaeological administration becomes intertwined with national politics and cultural identity. Heritage preservation extends beyond protecting physical artifacts to safeguarding historical narratives that support contemporary national identity. In post-colonial contexts, controlling historical narratives becomes particularly important as newly independent nations seek to establish cultural legitimacy and pride. Discoveries that complicate or challenge these narratives create administrative dilemmas. Acknowledge them and risk undermining carefully constructed heritage stories, or quietly suppress them and risk accusations of censorship and anti-scientific bias. Category 0 filing represents a middle path preserving materials while preventing their disruptive potential from affecting public historical understanding. The unofficial nature of Category 0 filing, never formally acknowledged or documented in organizational policies, provides plausible deniability. Without official recognition, administrators can deny the practice exists when questioned by researchers or journalists. This deniability protects the institution from accusations of censorship, while maintaining the practical effect of restricting access to controversial materials. The informal system also provides flexibility, allowing case-by-case decisions about what constitutes problematic, without establishing explicit criteria that could be challenged or debated publicly. British military records from the post-war period mention a curious mission conducted in Egypt in 1952, during the political turbulence preceding the Egyptian Revolution. A small team from British intelligence, working under the cover of archaeological survey, was granted access to conduct subsurface reconnaissance around the Giza Plateau using newly developed portable ground-penetrating sonar equipment. The official report from this mission remains classified, but a former intelligence officer, interviewed in 2007 under condition of anonymity, stated the team had been tasked with verifying the location of a specific chamber based on coordinates found in archive documentation related to pre-war German activities. They confirmed the chamber's existence but found the entrance sealed with approximately 60 tons of limestone blocks. The timing of this mission coincided with a critical period in Anglo-Egyptian relations. By 1952, Egyptian nationalism had reached a boiling point, with widespread demands for British withdrawal and the end of colonial influence. Within months, the Free Officers movement would overthrow King Farouk and establish a republic under Nasser's leadership. British intelligence agencies operated with heightened urgency during this transitional period, attempting to secure access to strategic assets and information before losing their privileged position in Egypt. The fact that intelligence resources were allocated to investigating an underground chamber at Giza during such political turbulence suggests authorities considered this investigation sufficiently important to justify the operational risks and diplomatic complications. The use of archaeological survey as operational cover provided convenient explanation for deploying detection equipment and conducting systematic ground scanning around the pyramids. Archaeological work required specialized instruments, offered plausible reasons for foreign experts to access restricted areas, and wouldn't immediately raise suspicions among Egyptian officials or observers. However, the involvement of intelligence personnel, rather than actual archaeologists, reveals the mission's true nature. Intelligence agencies don't typically involve themselves in pure academic research unless they perceive security implications, strategic value, or connections to intelligence operations. This military intelligence interest in Vogel's chamber suggests authorities believed it contained something beyond mere archaeological curiosity. The reference to archive documentation related to pre-war German activities confirms that British intelligence maintained files on Vogel's 1928 expedition 24 years after the events. These archives apparently contained specific enough information to provide coordinates for subsurface reconnaissance, indicating the British had obtained detailed documentation, possibly confiscated from German sources after the war, recovered from diplomatic channels, or compiled from their own surveillance of the original expedition. The preservation and continued relevance of this documentation implies authorities considered the chamber's contents potentially significant to post-war strategic interests. Ground-penetrating sonar technology in 1952 represented cutting-edge equipment, having been developed during and immediately after World War II for military applications including mine detection and submarine warfare. Deploying this advanced technology to Egypt, specifically to investigate Vogel's chamber, demonstrates significant resource commitment and suggests standard archaeological methods would be insufficient. The technology's military origins and the intelligence community's willingness to risk exposing its capabilities in a civilian context indicates the chamber verification mission carried high priority within British strategic planning. The confirmation of the chamber's existence with a sealed entrance validates both Blackwood's mapping and the oral histories describing deliberate closure. The specific weight estimate of approximately 60 tons of limestone blocks indicates the reconnaissance team attempted to assess the mass of sealing material, possibly using density measurements or calculating volume based on sonar imaging. This level of detail suggests they contemplated potential excavation operations and needed engineering data to plan the effort required to access the chamber. The substantial mass of blocking material, equivalent to roughly 24 standard limestone blocks, weighing 2.5 tons each, represents deliberate, permanent sealing, requiring significant labor and logistics to accomplish. The continued classification of the official report, 65 years after the mission, suggests its contents remain sensitive. Standard declassification procedures would typically release Cold War-era reconnaissance reports after several decades, particularly those related to archaeological sites, without obvious ongoing security implications. The fact that this particular report remains restricted indicates either its contents reveal operational methods still considered classified, involve parties or information requiring ongoing protection, or contain findings that authorities continue to deem inappropriate for public knowledge. The anonymous intelligence officer's willingness to confirm basic mission parameters, while the official documentation remains sealed, suggests internal disagreement about whether continued secrecy serves legitimate security interests or merely protects historical embarrassments. After returning to England in late 1928, Edmund Blackwood sought treatment from Dr. William Thornton, a London physician who specialised in tropical diseases and nervous conditions affecting those who had served in hot climates. Thornton's case notes, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians archives, describe Blackwood as suffering from acute anxiety, persistent insomnia, and intrusive thoughts of an obsessive nature. The notes mention that Blackwood was preoccupied with calculations and chronology, insisting that common historical understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization requires fundamental revision. Dr. Thornton prescribed rest and advised against any return to archaeological work, noting, "Patient appears haunted not by what he found, but by the implications of what it might mean." The medical classification of Blackwood's condition reflects early 20th century psychiatry's limited framework for understanding psychological trauma related to intellectual crises. Dr. Thornton's diagnosis: acute anxiety, insomnia, and obsessive thoughts captured symptoms without recognizing their underlying cause. Modern understanding would potentially classify Blackwood's state as cognitive dissonance, trauma, occurring when individuals encounter evidence so contradictory to their fundamental beliefs that their psychological framework struggles to accommodate the new information. For a meticulous surveyor trained in empirical observation and rational analysis, discovering physical evidence that undermined established historical chronology would create profound internal conflict between what he observed and what his education taught him was possible. The phrase, "preoccupied with calculations and chronology," indicates Blackwood couldn't stop mentally revisiting the measurements and dates associated with his Giza discoveries. This obsessive recalculation suggests he was attempting to find errors in his methodology, seeking ways to reconcile his observations with conventional chronology, or conversely, trying to develop alternative historical frameworks that could accommodate what he documented. Such persistent cognitive engagement represents the mind's attempt to resolve contradictions between sensory evidence and established knowledge. The fact that Blackwood sought medical treatment indicates this internal conflict had progressed beyond normal professional puzzlement into psychologically debilitating territory, affecting his sleep and daily functioning. Dr. Thornton's observation that Blackwood insisted historical understanding requires fundamental revision reveals the surveyor wasn't experiencing delusional thinking, but rather advocating for radical reinterpretation based on evidence. This distinction matters because it separates psychological distress caused by inconvenient discoveries from mental illness disconnected from reality. Blackwood's position that evidence demanded revising established chronology represents rational conclusion drawing that happened to conflict with academic consensus. His distress arose not from faulty reasoning but from the isolating experience of possessing evidence that colleagues would likely dismiss or that authorities had forbidden him from discussing openly. The most revealing element of Dr. Thornton's notes appears in his final observation. Patient appears haunted, not by what he found, but by the implications of what it might mean. This insight demonstrates Thornton recognized Blackwood's anxiety stemmed from intellectual rather than experiential trauma. Blackwood wasn't disturbed by physically descending into ancient chambers, encountering dangerous situations, or witnessing frightening phenomena. Instead, he struggled with the conceptual ramifications of his discoveries, what they suggested about human history, lost civilizations, and the reliability of established academic knowledge. This type of existential anxiety reflects wrestling with paradigm-shifting information that, if true, would require rebuilding fundamental assumptions about civilization's development and humanity's place in deep time. The prescription of rest and recommendation against returning to archaeological work suggests Dr. Thornton believed continued engagement with the source of Blackwood's anxiety would exacerbate his condition. From a medical perspective, this advice made sense, removing the patient from situations triggering psychological distress. However, this clinical approach failed to address Blackwood's core dilemma. He possessed evidence demanding investigation and publication, but sharing this evidence risked professional ridicule, potential legal consequences from violating confidentiality agreements, and psychological distress from public skepticism. The medical recommendation to abandon archaeological work essentially counseled him to suppress his most significant discoveries and live with unresolved intellectual questions. Blackwood's subsequent life trajectory suggests he never fully recovered from this psychological burden. Instead, taking a position as a surveyor for municipal planning projects in Manchester work, utilising his technical skills while avoiding the intellectual conflicts associated with ancient history. His daughter later reported that he remained withdrawn and uncommunicative about his Egyptian experiences, maintaining his silence until death. Despite the obvious psychological toll this secrecy exacted, the medical records thus document not just individual psychological struggle, but the human cost of possessing knowledge too controversial to share and too compelling to forget. Newly released KGB documents from the Cold War era reveal that Soviet intelligence maintained files on several archaeological sites worldwide, tracking discoveries that might have military or strategic significance. Among these files was a dossier on Object Giza 7, which appears to reference the chamber discovered by Vogel's expedition. The documents, heavily redacted, indicate the Soviets attempted to locate the chamber in 1957 during a period of improved Soviet-Egyptian relations, using georesonance equipment and modified seismic sensors. The operation was apparently unsuccessful, though one memo notes, American presence in area suggests parallel knowledge, recommend continued monitoring. The Soviet interest in archaeological sites with potential strategic value reflects Cold War intelligence doctrine that sought advantages in unconventional domains. While Western intelligence agencies focused primarily on military installations and political developments, Soviet intelligence maintained broader definitions of strategic assets, including technologies or knowledge from ancient civilizations that might offer insights into advanced materials, construction techniques, or theoretical principles applicable to modern challenges. This approach positioned archaeology not merely as academic pursuit, but as potential source of technological intelligence, particularly regarding structures or artifacts demonstrating capabilities inexplicable through conventional historical understanding. The designation Object Giza 7 implies the Soviets catalogued multiple sites of interest at the Giza Plateau, with this chamber representing the seventh documented target. This systematic classification suggests comprehensive intelligence gathering about the entire complex, likely compiled from captured German documents after World War II, information shared by Egyptian sources during periods of Soviet-Egyptian cooperation or surveillance of Western archaeological activities. The numerical designation indicates bureaucratic organization treating the chamber as one element within broader reconnaissance objectives, rather than isolated curiosity, suggesting Soviet intelligence maintained active files on numerous allegedly significant archaeological locations worldwide. The timing of the 1957 operation coincided with peak Soviet influence in Egypt. Following the Suez Crisis of 1956, Egypt under Nasser aligned increasingly with the Soviet bloc, accepting military aid, economic assistance, and technical advisors. This relationship provided Soviet intelligence unprecedented access to Egyptian sites and resources that had previously been controlled by Western powers. The attempt to locate the chamber during this window suggests Soviet planners viewed improved access as temporary opportunity, requiring exploitation before geopolitical circumstances changed. The operation's failure indicates either the sealing was too effective to penetrate with available technology, the coordinates in Soviet archives were insufficiently precise, or Egyptian authorities restricted access more than the Soviets anticipated. The mention of geo-resonance equipment and modified seismic sensors reveals deployment of advanced detection technology specifically adapted for this mission. Georesonance techniques measure subsurface density variations and can detect voids, different rock types, or anomalies indicating artificial construction. Modified seismic sensors suggest customization beyond standard geological surveying equipment, possibly adapted to detect specific signatures associated with underground chambers, or to penetrate deeper than conventional instruments. The Soviets' willingness to deploy specialized equipment indicates significant operational investment and suggests they possess detailed technical specifications about the chamber's depth, size, or construction materials requiring particular detection approaches. The observation about American presence in area proves particularly significant, revealing that Soviet intelligence detected competing US interest in the same objective. This suggests both superpowers independently obtained information about Vogel's chamber and recognized its potential significance. The parallel interests transformed the chamber from archaeological curiosity into Cold War intelligence target, with both sides attempting to locate and potentially access whatever it contained before their rivals succeeded. The recommendation for continued monitoring indicates Soviet intelligence maintained active surveillance of American archaeological and scientific activities at Giza, treating the area as theater for ongoing intelligence competition. The heavy redactions in released documents prevent full understanding of Soviet motivations and findings. Standard declassification protocols typically redact information that could compromise intelligence methods, reveal source identities, or contain details about ongoing operations. The extent of redaction in the Giza 7 file suggests either the operation involved methods still considered classified decades later, the documents reference individuals or organizations requiring ongoing protection, or the findings remain deemed too sensitive for public disclosure. This continued classification parallels the British experience with their 1952 reconnaissance report, suggesting multiple intelligence agencies across different nations maintain policies restricting information about the chamber despite the passage of considerable time. In March 1928, just before the expedition's departure, Dr. Heinrich Vogel received a letter at his hotel in Alexandria. The letter, written in German on plain paper with no return address, was found among Vogel's possessions at the hotel after his disappearance. It warned him explicitly against pursuing the chamber, stated that some doors were sealed by those wiser than us, and concluded with, "The Brotherhood has guarded this threshold for 3,000 years and will not permit its opening in our lifetime." Egyptian police investigated the letter as a possible threat, but concluded it was likely a hoax designed to discourage the expedition. The paper was analysed and determined to be of Egyptian manufacture, but the ink contained trace elements of a mineral compound that forensic analysis in the 1,920 seconds couldn't fully identify. The letter's composition in German rather than English or French reveals significant information about its author. German was not widely spoken in Egypt during this period outside diplomatic and academic circles, suggesting the writer possessed education in German language or had specific knowledge that Vogel was German. The choice to write in Vogel's native language rather than a lingua franca, like English, indicates either the author wanted to ensure clear communication without translation, ambiguity, or sought to demonstrate intimate knowledge of Vogel's identity and background. This personalization suggests the warning came from someone monitoring the expedition closely, rather than a general intimidation tactic. The specific reference to the chamber is particularly revealing since Vogel's official permits listed various innocuous archaeological objectives without mentioning underground exploration. The letter writer's knowledge that Vogel's true target was a specific chamber indicates either infiltration of the expedition's planning discussions, surveillance of private correspondence, or insider information from sources with access to Vogel's actual intentions beyond his official cover story. This precision transformed the letter from vague threat into demonstration that the sender possessed detailed intelligence about the expedition's covert objectives. The invocation of the Brotherhood directly connects the warning to the secret society mentioned in other contemporary archaeological correspondence. The phrase, "guarded this threshold for 3,000 years," suggests organizational continuity across enormous spans of time, positioning the Brotherhood not as modern conspiracy, but as ancient institution maintaining unbroken succession since pharaonic times. Whether this claim represents genuine historical continuity, adopted mythology to enhance authority, or psychological warfare designed to intimidate through historical mystique remains unclear. However, the specificity 3,000 years rather than vague ancient times suggests deliberate calculation, possibly positioning the Brotherhood's founding during the late period of Egyptian history, when priests consolidated power and protected temple knowledge from foreign influences. The phrase, "some doors were sealed by those wiser than us," implies the chamber's closure was protective rather than punitive, suggesting its contents posed dangers that ancient authorities understood and modern explorers might not. This framing positions the Brotherhood as custodians of protective measures implemented by predecessors with superior wisdom or knowledge. The statement contains implicit argument that respecting ancient seals represents prudent deference to those who better understood what they were protecting against, rather than superstitious fear of curses or arbitrary obstruction of scientific inquiry. The final warning, "will not permit its opening in our lifetime," constitutes explicit threat while maintaining ambiguous interpretation. It could represent prediction based on confidence in the Brotherhood's protective capabilities, promise of active intervention to prevent access, or statement of fact about protective measures already in place that would prove insurmountable. The phrasing carefully avoids specific threats that would clearly constitute criminal intimidation, while unmistakably communicating that opening the chamber would encounter organized resistance. The forensic analysis of the ink provides intriguing physical evidence about the letter's origins. While the paper was standard Egyptian manufacture available commercially, the ink's unusual mineral composition suggests either custom formulation or ancient source material. Some researchers have speculated the ink might have incorporated minerals from pharaonic-era pigments, either symbolically connecting the warning to ancient authority or practically utilizing materials from genuinely old sources. However, 1,920 seconds forensic chemistry lacked the analytical precision to definitively identify complex mineral compositions, leaving this question unresolved. Modern forensic techniques could potentially characterize the ink more precisely, but the letter's current location remains unknown, possibly lost among materials confiscated or destroyed after Vogel's disappearance. The Egyptian police dismissal of the letter as hoax reflects institutional bias toward rationalist explanations over acknowledgement of secret societies or ancient conspiracies. Characterizing it as intimidation tactic allowed authorities to close investigation without confronting uncomfortable questions about the Brotherhood's existence, influence, or knowledge. This dismissive response might also indicate police awareness that investigating further would encounter resistance from parties they preferred not to confront, or that the Brotherhood's connections extended into law enforcement itself, making genuine investigation diplomatically impossible. The expedition's accounts describe entering a chamber carved directly into bedrock at a depth that would place it below the current water table of the Giza Plateau. Geological surveys confirm that the limestone bedrock in that area is separated from the underground aquifer by only a few meters in most locations. For a chamber to exist at the described depth without flooding would require sophisticated drainage and waterproofing techniques that conventional Egyptology doesn't attribute to pre-dynastic or Old Kingdom builders. Either the water table has risen significantly since the chamber's construction, which would require it to be far older than the pyramids themselves, or the builders possessed hydraulic engineering knowledge well beyond what surviving Egyptian records suggest. Modern hydrological studies of the Giza Plateau reveal complex subsurface water dynamics, influenced by Nile flood patterns, seasonal variation, and geological formations channeling groundwater through the limestone. The water table's current position results from thousands of years of accumulated changes, agricultural development, irrigation practices, dam construction, and climate variations, all affecting groundwater levels. However, geological evidence suggests the water table has generally risen over millennia rather than fallen, meaning ancient structures built below current water levels would have been even deeper beneath historical groundwater in antiquity. This geological reality makes permanently dry underground chambers at significant depth extremely challenging to explain without invoking advanced construction techniques. The engineering required to create and maintain dry subsurface chambers involves multiple interconnected challenges. First, excavation itself becomes problematic below the water table, as groundwater continuously seeps into workspaces, requiring constant pumping or drainage during construction. Second, finished chambers require waterproofing to prevent ongoing infiltration either through impermeable barrier materials, sophisticated drainage systems channeling water away, or both. Third, long-term maintenance systems must function across centuries or millennia to prevent eventual flooding. Each of these challenges demands engineering sophistication and material science knowledge that archaeological evidence rarely documents in ancient Egyptian civilization. Some researchers propose the chambers were constructed during periods when the water table was naturally lower, specifically during the African humid period's conclusion, around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, when climate transitions temporarily altered hydrology throughout the region. This hypothesis would place construction earlier than conventional pyramid dating, but still within timeframes when organized societies existed in Egypt. However, even this explanation requires the builders to anticipate future water table rise and implement protective measures, ensuring chambers would remain dry as hydrological conditions changed over subsequent millennia, still representing remarkable geological foresight and engineering capability. Alternative explanations involve sophisticated drainage systems, removing water as it infiltrates. Ancient civilizations, including Rome, Greece, and even earlier cultures, developed impressive hydraulic engineering, including aqueducts, drainage tunnels, and water management infrastructure. However, these systems required ongoing maintenance, eventual repair, and active management. For drainage systems, protecting underground chambers to function across thousands of years without maintenance implies engineering principles focused on passive, permanent solutions rather than active management. Perhaps gravity-fed drainage channels leading to natural sinkholes or aquifer layers below the chamber level, automatically removing infiltrating water without human intervention. The waterproofing materials available to ancient builders typically included various natural substances, bitumen, resins, mineral compounds, and specialized plasters. Archaeological evidence shows Egyptians used these materials for boat construction, building foundations, and water storage, demonstrating awareness of waterproofing principles. However, application at the scale required for large underground chambers, combined with longevity lasting millennia, would represent extraordinary achievement. Modern analysis of any remaining waterproofing materials in the chamber could potentially identify their composition and construction techniques, providing insights into ancient capabilities that surviving texts and artifacts haven't adequately documented. The geological evidence paradox presents binary conclusions. Either accept that the chamber's depth and dry condition indicate construction during a period with dramatically different hydrology, thousands of years before conventional pyramid dating, or acknowledge that Old Kingdom builders possessed hydraulic engineering expertise, substantially more sophisticated than currently recognized. Both options challenge established archaeological narratives. The first, by pushing advanced construction capabilities back to prehistoric periods; the second, by revealing significant gaps in understanding documented civilizations' technical knowledge. The existence of dry chambers at impossible depths forces reconsideration of either chronology or capability, with profound implications regardless of which explanation ultimately proves correct. When Michael Hendricks had Edmund Blackwood's 3 film rolls developed in 1984, the photography lab noted that the completely blackened third roll showed exposure patterns inconsistent with accidental light exposure or radiation damage. The emulsion had been uniformly affected across all frames, suggesting the film had been deliberately erased using electromagnetic or radiation-based methods. Hendricks consulted with Kodak's technical department, who confirmed the film had definitely been exposed to something but couldn't determine what. The timing suggested the film had been wiped after the expedition but before Blackwood's death in 1953, raising questions about who had access to his possessions and what they had been trying to conceal. The distinction between accidental exposure and deliberate erasure reveals sophisticated understanding of photographic science. Accidental light exposure typically affects film unevenly. More damage near the canister opening, gradient patterns where light leaked through gaps, or localized spots where the film was directly exposed. Radiation damage from natural sources creates random patterns, with some areas affected more than others, depending on exposure, intensity, and duration. The uniform blackening across all frames suggests controlled, intentional process designed to thoroughly destroy whatever images the film contained, while leaving the physical film stock intact. This precision implies access to specialized equipment and technical knowledge about photographic materials. Kodak's inability to identify the specific erasure method indicates exposure to something unusual for 1,920 seconds or early 1,950 seconds technology. Industrial or military facilities might possess equipment capable of generating sufficiently intense electromagnetic fields or radiation to uniformly affect film emulsion, but such capabilities weren't widely available. The fact that technical experts could confirm intentional erasure without identifying the specific method suggests the process involved technology or techniques outside normal photographic industry experience. This raises possibilities, including government or military involvement, access to research facilities with experimental equipment, or even exposure to materials or energies associated with whatever the chamber contained. The timeline narrows the window when erasure occurred. Blackwood returned from Egypt in late 1928, with the film still sealed in its protective canister. He died in 1953, and the camera case remained in family storage until 1983. At some point during those 25 years, someone accessed Blackwood's possessions, identified which film roll contained sensitive images, and subjected it to erasure treatment, while leaving the other 2 rolls intact. This selective destruction indicates the person responsible could distinguish between roles, suggesting they either examined the developed images and then erased one set, or possessed prior knowledge about which role documented the underground chamber. The selective preservation of the first two film rolls serves an important purpose, maintaining plausible deniability. Destroying all three rolls would obviously indicate tampering, potentially drawing attention and investigation. Leaving two rolls intact, showing innocent surface activities while erasing only the problematic underground documentation, creates appearance of partial accident or natural degradation rather than deliberate censorship. This calculated approach suggests sophisticated operational thinking, rather than crude destruction of all evidence. The question of access reveals limited possibilities. Either Blackwood himself performed the erasure, perhaps under pressure, or to protect himself from consequences of possessing forbidden documentation, or external parties gained access to his possessions, possibly through legal authority, like search warrants, covert entry by intelligence services, or cooperation from family members unaware of the material's significance. Each scenario implies different conclusions about the level of threat Blackwood faced and the resources authorities devoted to suppressing evidence from an expedition that officially never occurred. Several members of Vogel's expedition had documented interests in Hermeticism. Marcus Reeves had published an article in 1926 exploring the mathematical principles in Hermetic texts and their possible connection to pyramid geometry. Edmund Blackwood's library, catalogued after his death, contained extensively annotated copies of Hermetic writings, including the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet. These interests were not unusual among educated Europeans of the era, but their convergence in a single expedition, combined with the subsequent mystery surrounding what they found, has led some researchers to speculate they were searching for something specific, perhaps guided by knowledge encoded in those ancient texts. Hermeticism's core claim that wisdom from a civilization predating dynastic Egypt survived through encoded texts and initiatory traditions aligns provocatively with the expedition's apparent discoveries. The Hermetic tradition attributes its knowledge to Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, identified by Greeks with Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly a sage from Egypt's most ancient period who preserved knowledge from a previous age. If expedition members believed Hermetic texts contained genuine geographical or technical information rather than merely allegorical philosophy, they might have approached their Egyptian exploration not as open-ended archaeological survey, but as treasure hunt, guided by specific textual clues. Reeves' 1926 article examining mathematical principles in Hermetic writings demonstrates he took these texts seriously as potential sources of technical knowledge rather than dismissing them as mystical allegory. His analysis focused on numerical relationships, geometric progressions, and proportional systems mentioned in Hermetic sources, attempting to demonstrate correspondence with measurements found in pyramid architecture. This approach, treating ancient esoteric texts as encoded technical manuals, represented controversial methodology that mainstream archaeology rejected, but which appealed to researchers convinced that ancient wisdom traditions preserved genuine knowledge in symbolic forms designed to survive across millennia. Despite cultural disruptions and religious persecutions, Blackwood's extensive annotations in his Hermetic texts provide tantalizing evidence of active engagement with these materials beyond casual reading. Annotations might include cross-references to Egyptian sites, mathematical calculations connecting Hermetic numerical systems to architectural measurements, or linguistic analysis attempting to decode symbolic language into geographical coordinates or technical specifications. Unfortunately, Blackwood's annotated books have not been located since his estate was dispersed, making it impossible to examine what connections he drew between Hermetic philosophy and practical exploration objectives. The convergence of multiple expedition members sharing these interests suggests either deliberate recruitment based on Hermetic knowledge or natural affiliation among like-minded researchers attracted to similar ideas. If Vogel assembled his team specifically seeking individuals familiar with Hermetic traditions, it implies the expedition's planning incorporated esoteric research alongside conventional archaeology. Alternatively, scholarly communities exploring connections between ancient wisdom traditions and Egyptian monuments naturally overlapped, meaning researchers studying pyramid geometry and pre-dynastic civilizations would frequently encounter Hermetic materials and might organically develop interest in these traditions. The as above, so below principle central to Hermetic philosophy, that celestial patterns reflect in earthly structures, directly connects to Reeves's astronomical alignment research. Hermetic cosmology emphasizes correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, suggesting sacred architecture should mirror celestial arrangements. This principle would guide researchers toward investigating whether pyramid complexes encoded astronomical knowledge, potentially including stellar positions from ancient epochs preserved in architectural alignments. The expedition's focus on underground chambers might reflect Hermetic teachings about hidden wisdom, requiring descent into darkness before achieving enlightenment, with physical descent into subterranean spaces mirroring symbolic journey toward concealed knowledge. Unlike most archaeological digs of the period, which generated extensive oral histories preserved in local communities, the Vogel expedition left almost no trace in the memories of Egyptian workers' descendants. Dr. Fathy's research found that when he asked elderly residents about the German dig of 1928, most claimed to have never heard of it, even though employment records confirmed dozens of local men worked at the site. The few who acknowledged any knowledge became uncomfortable when pressed for details, and several refused to continue the interview. One elderly woman, whose grandfather had been a foreman on various Giza excavations, stated simply, "Some things are not meant to be spoken about." The old ones knew this, and they were wise. The systematic absence of oral tradition surrounding an event that employed dozens of workers represents profound cultural silence that extends beyond individual discretion. Egyptian communities surrounding Giza maintained rich traditions of storytelling about archaeological work, with excavation experiences becoming family narratives passed through generations. Workers typically shared stories about foreign archaeologists, unusual discoveries, dangerous incidents, and notable personalities. These narratives formed part of local identity and connection to the monuments. The Vogel expedition's complete erasure from this oral tradition suggests either collective trauma that communities chose to forget, enforcement of silence so effective it persisted across generations, or active cultural taboo making discussion forbidden, regardless of external consequences. The employment records, confirming dozens of workers participated, creates uncomfortable contradiction with claimed ignorance. Dr. Fathy's interviewees weren't being asked about vague rumours or distant events. Many had direct family connections to documented participants. For descendants to claim complete ignorance about work their grandfathers performed suggests either deliberate family silence, where information was consciously withheld from younger generations, or successful external suppression, where workers were prevented from sharing experiences even within their own families. Both possibilities indicate extraordinary circumstances surrounding the expedition that motivated or required this comprehensive information control. The visible discomfort and interview terminations when Dr. Fathy pressed for details reveal that silence resulted from ongoing fear or cultural prohibition rather than genuine ignorance. If interviewees truly knew nothing, they would express simple inability to help, rather than becoming uncomfortable and refusing to continue conversations. Their reactions suggest they possessed knowledge but considered sharing it dangerous, improper, or forbidden. This active resistance to disclosure decades after the events indicates either continuing external threats, deeply internalized cultural taboos, or genuine belief that discussing certain matters would bring harmful consequences. The elderly woman's statement, "Some things are not meant to be spoken about," articulates explicit philosophy, justifying silence. Her characterization of this discretion as wisdom transmitted from the Old Ones, positions the silence not as imposed censorship, but as traditional knowledge about proper boundaries. This perspective suggests Egyptian workers understood or believed the chamber, and its contents represented matters beyond ordinary archaeological interest. Perhaps sacred spaces that should remain undisturbed, dangerous knowledge that could harm those who possessed it, or secrets that powerful interests would violently protect. Her framing presents silence as protective wisdom rather than oppressive secrecy. The differential treatment between workers' comprehensive silence about Vogel's expedition versus their normal willingness to share stories about other archaeological work highlights the unique status of this particular dig. If workers and their families routinely discussed employment on various excavations, but specifically avoided mentioning the 1928 expedition, it indicates they distinguished this event as fundamentally different from normal archaeological labour. This selective amnesia suggests the expedition crossed boundaries, whether cultural, spiritual, or practical, that separated acceptable archaeological work from forbidden territory that communities collectively agreed should not be acknowledged or discussed with outsiders. The persistence of silence into the 21st century, 3/4 of a century after the events, demonstrates the effectiveness of whatever combination of threats, incentives, and cultural pressures enforced this collective amnesia. Most institutional secrets eventually leak as participants age, fear consequences less, and prioritize historical truth over organizational loyalty. The Egyptian workers' descendants maintaining silence despite these typical erosions of secrecy suggests either extraordinary initial enforcement that created lasting cultural trauma, ongoing reminders that maintained compliance, or genuine internalized belief that speaking carried spiritual or practical dangers outweighing any benefits of disclosure. Among the few artifacts that can be definitively traced to the expedition is a small metallic object, roughly cylindrical, about 8 centimeters long, that was found in Edmund Blackwood's effects and eventually donated to the British Museum in 1985 by his granddaughter. The object was catalogued as unknown origin, possibly modern, and placed in storage. When it was finally analysed in 2003 using modern spectroscopy, the results were puzzling. The metal composition included copper, tin, and trace amounts of elements including arsenic and antimony, consistent with some Bronze Age alloys, but with unusually high purity levels and a crystalline structure suggesting sophisticated metallurgical processes. The object's purpose remains unclear, but markings on its surface appear to be deliberately inscribed symbols that don't match any known Egyptian script. The initial misidentification as possibly modern reflects how anomalous artifacts that don't fit established categories often get dismissed rather than investigated. Museum curators encountering objects that combine ancient-appearing metallurgy with unexplained characteristics frequently default to assuming modern manufacture, particularly when provenance documentation is incomplete. This classification bias means potentially significant artifacts spend decades in storage, because their features contradict expectations about what ancient materials should look like. Blackwood's granddaughter likely provided minimal context when donating her grandfather's possessions. Possibly unaware of or unwilling to discuss their Egyptian origins, leading cataloguers to treat the object as curiosity rather than archaeological specimen requiring detailed study. The 2003 spectroscopic analysis revealed metallurgical sophistication that challenges assumptions about Bronze Age capabilities. While the basic alloy composition copper and tin creating bronze aligns with ancient metalworking traditions, the exceptionally high purity levels and crystalline structure indicate manufacturing processes beyond typical ancient techniques. Bronze Age metallurgy generally produced materials with significant impurities and irregular crystalline formations, resulting from variable furnace temperatures and unrefined ore processing. Achieving high purity levels requires selective ore refining, controlled smelting temperatures, and systematic removal of impurities capabilities that would imply more sophisticated understanding of materials science than surviving ancient texts and archaeological evidence typically document. The crystalline structure particularly intrigues materials scientists because it indicates controlled cooling and possibly specialized heat treatment processes. When molten metal solidifies, crystal formation depends heavily on cooling rate and temperature management. Random cooling produces irregular crystal structures with varying grain sizes. The organized crystalline structure detected in Blackwood's artifact suggests controlled solidification, possibly programmed cooling rates, specialized furnace environments, or post-casting heat treatments that reorganize molecular structure. These techniques wouldn't be systematically developed in Western metallurgy until the Industrial Revolution, though isolated examples of sophisticated metalworking appear sporadically in various ancient cultures, suggesting pockets of advanced knowledge that mainstream historical narratives underestimate. The inscribed symbol's failure to match any known Egyptian script presents interpretive challenges. If the object originated from the chamber Vogel discovered, the unknown writing system would corroborate expedition accounts describing symbols unlike any catalogued Egyptian language. This linguistic isolation would support theories about pre-dynastic cultures or lost civilizations possessing their own writing systems that didn't survive into historical periods. Alternatively, the symbols might represent technical notation, numerical systems, or specialized religious scripts used only in specific contexts, and thus never documented in surviving texts that focused on administrative, religious, or literary content. The object's cylindrical form and 8 cm length suggest possible functional purposes, perhaps a tool component, measuring instrument, astronomical calculation device, or ritual implement. Without additional examples or contextual information about where within the chamber it was found, determining its function remains speculative. However, the combination of sophisticated metallurgy and unknown inscriptions indicates it served purposes beyond simple ornamental or common utilitarian roles, suggesting specialized knowledge both in its manufacture and use. The artifact's residence in British Museum storage for 18 years before analysis highlights systemic problems in archaeological collections management. Major museums house millions of artifacts, many inadequately catalogued or studied. Objects that seem unremarkable or lack clear historical significance may never receive detailed analysis despite potentially containing revolutionary information. Blackwood's metallic cylinder might have remained forever uninvestigated if not for periodic collection reviews that subjected long-stored items to modern analytical techniques, accidentally uncovering its anomalous properties decades after acquisition. In 1936, 8 years after the original expedition, a small team from the American Research Center in Egypt received permission to conduct verification studies at Giza, ostensibly to confirm some of the measurements made by earlier surveys. The team's leader, Dr. Albert Whitman, had privately corresponded with Edmund Blackwood in 1929, discussing anomalies in the Geological Survey data. The American team spent only 3 weeks at the site before abruptly departing Egypt. Dr. Whitman's official report described the mission as successful, but provided no specific findings. His personal papers, donated to Yale University's archives after his death in 1968, include a folder labeled Giza 1936 that is conspicuously empty except for a single index card reading. Some questions are better left unasked. The 1,929 correspondence between Whitman and Blackwood establishes direct information transfer from the original expedition to American researchers. Blackwood's willingness to discuss anomalies in the Geological Survey data with an American colleague suggests he sought validation from independent sources, hoping to verify his findings through additional investigation without personally returning to Egypt. This communication channel meant American institutions possessed information about Vogel's discoveries years before mounting their own expedition, allowing time for planning and determining whether follow-up investigation warranted resource investment and potential diplomatic complications with Egyptian authorities. The euphemistic official mission description, verification studies, confirming earlier measurements provided bureaucratic cover for what was likely targeted investigation of the underground chamber. Requesting permits explicitly to investigate unauthorized German excavations from 1928 would have raised uncomfortable questions and faced certain denial. By framing their work as routine verification of standard surveying data, Whitman's team obtained access while maintaining plausible deniability about their true objectives. This approach mirrors how Vogel himself used multiple permit applications with different stated purposes to obscure his actual intentions. The 3-week duration before abrupt departure suggests either the team quickly found what they sought and decided immediate evacuation was prudent, or they encountered circumstances that made continuing work impossible or inadvisable. 3 weeks provided sufficient time for preliminary investigation, limited excavation or chamber access, and documentation of findings, but fell far short of comprehensive archaeological study. The sudden termination implies either satisfactory rapid confirmation of Blackwood's data, making extended work unnecessary, discovery of something disturbing enough to warrant immediate withdrawal, or external pressure, possibly from Egyptian authorities, the Brotherhood, or other interested parties that forced their departure. Dr. Whitman's official report describing the mission as successful without providing specific findings represents classic bureaucratic obfuscation. Success typically implies achieving stated objectives, yet the absence of detailed results contradicts standard archaeological practice, where successful expeditions produce comprehensive documentation, measurements, photographs, and analysis. This gap between claimed success and absence of supporting data indicates the mission's true objectives differed from official statements, with actual findings deemed too sensitive for public reporting. The vague report satisfied administrative requirements for expedition documentation, while carefully avoiding any substantive information that might draw attention or invite scrutiny. The empty folder labelled Giza 1936 in Whitman's personal archives represents perhaps the most telling evidence of deliberate information suppression. Personal papers typically contain working notes, preliminary observations, correspondence, sketches, and draft reports. The informal documentation that researchers accumulate during active projects. The folder's existence proves Whitman originally maintained Giza-related materials, while its emptiness indicates subsequent removal of contents. Whether Whitman himself destroyed these materials, external parties confiscated them, or executors removed sensitive papers before donating his archive to Yale remains unknown, but the result systematically eliminates the documentary trail that would explain what the 1936 expedition actually discovered. The single remaining index card's message, "Some questions are better left unasked," echoes the recurring theme throughout the Vogel expedition story of knowledge, deliberately suppressed rather than pursued. This philosophical statement transcends simple scientific caution, suggesting Whitman concluded that certain lines of inquiry, regardless of their potential to yield fascinating discoveries, carried consequences outweighing benefits. Whether these consequences involve professional reputation, personal safety, institutional stability, or broader concerns about destabilizing established historical narratives, Whitman's conclusion that silence served wisdom represents the ultimate triumph of censorship over curiosity that defines the entire hidden history of the 1928 chamber discovery. In 1974, a joint French-Egyptian team conducted a comprehensive muon tomography study of the Great Pyramid, using cosmic ray detectors to map the pyramid's internal structure without invasive excavation. While analyzing their data, technicians noted anomalous radiation readings coming from an area approximately 150 meters northeast of the Sphinx at a depth of about 25 meters. The readings didn't match the background radiation typical of limestone, but the team's report attributed this to possible geological irregularities or mineral deposits. A researcher who worked on the project, speaking years later, admitted they had been instructed not to investigate the anomaly further. We were told that area was of no archaeological interest and to focus our instruments on the pyramid itself. Muon tomography represented cutting-edge archaeological technology in 1974, using cosmic ray particles that naturally penetrate deep underground to create density maps of subsurface structures. The technique detects variations in muon absorption. Dense materials absorb more particles, while voids allow more to pass through. Radiation anomalies detected during muon studies indicate either unexpected material composition or radioactive elements not typically found in natural limestone formations. The fact that technicians noted these readings as anomalous suggests they deviated significantly from expected background levels, indicating either unusual geological features or artificial materials with different radioactive signatures than surrounding bedrock. The location of the anomaly, 150 meters northeast of the Sphinx at 25-meter depth, corresponds remarkably closely to positions indicated on Blackwood's 1928 map and coordinates that British intelligence investigated in 1952. This geographical consistency across multiple independent detection methods spanning nearly 50 years strongly suggests a genuine subsurface feature rather than measurement error or geological coincidence. The depth of 25 meters places the anomaly below the current water table, corroborating accounts of chambers existing at depths requiring sophisticated drainage or waterproofing to remain accessible. The official explanation attributing anomalous readings to geological irregularities or mineral deposits provides convenient rationalization that discourages further investigation. Limestone formations can contain various mineral inclusions, and certain mineral combinations produce slightly elevated radiation through naturally occurring radioactive isotopes like potassium-40 or trace uranium compounds. However, professional geologists can typically distinguish between natural mineral deposits and other sources of radiation. The vague attribution to possible irregularities suggests either the team couldn't definitively identify the source or were providing deliberately ambiguous explanation to satisfy reporting requirements without acknowledging more interesting possibilities. The researchers' later admission about being instructed to avoid investigating the anomaly reveals active management of the scientific investigation. Instructions to ignore detected anomalies and focus exclusively on predetermined targets represents antithetical to scientific inquiry's fundamental principles of following evidence wherever it leads. This directive indicates authorities or project leadership possessed prior knowledge about the area and deliberately structured the investigation to avoid confirming or documenting the anomaly's nature. Such instructions could originate from Egyptian antiquities. Officials protecting sensitive sites, international parties with interests in maintaining secrecy about the chamber, or project leaders who understood that investigating certain areas would trigger complications with permits, funding, or diplomatic relationships. The claim that the area was of no archaeological interest directly contradicts the radiation reading's anomalous nature. Any unexpected subsurface feature detected through sophisticated scanning technology automatically becomes archaeologically interesting. Dismissing detected anomalies as uninteresting before investigation represents obvious logical contradiction. The instruction reveals exactly the opposite. The area held significant interest, but investigation was specifically forbidden. The radiation signature itself raises intriguing questions about what materials might produce such readings. Natural radioactive decay from geological sources produces predictable patterns. Artificial materials, including certain ancient pigments, metal alloys, or architectural materials, can generate unusual radiation signatures. Some researchers have speculatively suggested the anomaly might indicate materials with unusual elemental composition, possibly including rare earth elements, or metal alloys, not typically associated with ancient construction. More exotic theories propose the readings could indicate residual effects from materials or technologies whose properties we don't fully understand. Without access to detailed spectroscopic analysis of the radiation signature data that was apparently never collected or has been classified, determining the anomaly's source remains impossible. The 1,974 teams' experience represents another iteration of the recurring pattern. Modern technology independently detects evidence corroborating historical accounts of the chamber, investigation approaches confirmation, and authorities intervene to prevent definitive documentation. This cycle, repeating across decades and involving parties from multiple nations, suggests coordinated effort to maintain uncertainty about the chamber's contents while preventing absolute proof that would force public acknowledgement. Dr. Heinrich Vogel published a well-regarded book in 1925 titled Subsurface Archaeology, Methods and Applications, which became a standard reference for excavation techniques. The book contained 12 chapters covering various aspects of archaeological surveying. However, a draft table of contents found in the Berlin Archaeological Society's library lists 13 chapters, with the final chapter titled Detecting and Accessing Sealed Chambers. Letters between Vogel and his publisher, preserved in the publisher's archives, show a dispute in early 1925 over material deemed too speculative for academic publication, with Vogel eventually agreeing to remove the final chapter and related appendices. The timing of this publication dispute, occurring 3 years before Vogel's Egyptian expedition, suggests his interest in sealed chambers predated his actual attempt to access one at Giza. Writing an entire chapter on detecting and accessing such chambers indicates Vogel had developed specific theories, techniques, or knowledge about their existence and location. The fact that he considered this material significant enough to include in his professional reference work implies confidence in its practical application, rather than purely theoretical speculation. His willingness to eventually remove the chapter to secure publication suggests external pressure or recognition that making such information publicly available might jeopardize future opportunities to actually implement the techniques he described. The publisher's characterization of the material as too speculative for academic publication reveals tension between Vogel's ideas and acceptable professional discourse. Academic publishers in 1,920 seconds, Germany maintained strict standards requiring evidence-based arguments supported by documented fieldwork. For an entire chapter to be rejected as too speculative implies Vogel made claims about sealed chambers' existence or characteristics without sufficient archaeological evidence to support them. Alternatively, the speculation might have involved techniques for accessing chambers that raised ethical or legal concerns. Violation, activities that professional archaeological associations increasingly condemned during this period. The reference to related appendices indicates the removed chapter was part of more extensive material on this subject. Appendices typically contain supporting documentation, detailed technical specifications, equipment descriptions, case studies, or reference materials. The plural form suggests multiple appendices, implying substantial additional content beyond the main chapter. This extensive development of sealed chamber material reinforces the interpretation that Vogel possessed detailed knowledge, or theories requiring comprehensive documentation, rather than passing speculation that could be addressed in a single chapter. The correspondence describing Vogel's agreement to remove this material uses language suggesting reluctant compromise rather than willing acceptance of editorial judgment. The phrase, eventually agreeing, implies negotiation and resistance before capitulation. Vogel likely understood that publishing controversial material would jeopardize the book's reception and potentially his professional reputation, making strategic retreat necessary despite believing in his material's value. This decision allowed the book's publication while preserving his sealed chamber knowledge for potential future use, exactly what apparently occurred 3 years later in Egypt. The missing chapter's content remains unknown, leaving researchers to speculate about what techniques, theories, or information Vogel developed. Did he possess specific knowledge about the Giza chamber's location derived from historical texts, Hermetic sources, or previous archaeological observations? Did he develop electromagnetic detection methods, or other technical approaches for identifying sealed voids? Did he describe historical examples of sealed chambers and analyze patterns in their construction that would guide searchers towards similar structures? Any of these possibilities would explain both why the material seemed too speculative for 1925 publication, and why Vogel felt confident mounting an expensive, risky expedition to Egypt 3 years later. The absence of manuscript copies of the removed chapter represents another instance of vanishing documentation. Publishers typically retained draft materials, authors kept copies of unpublished work, and academic societies often acquired such materials for historical archives. The fact that only the draft table of contents survived while the actual chapter disappeared suggests either Vogel retrieved all copies after the publication dispute, the material was later deemed sensitive and destroyed, or parties interested in maintaining secrecy about sealed chambers systematically removed this documentation from archival collections. The pattern mirrors the broader evidence suppression characterizing the entire Vogel expedition story. Geological records from the Egyptian Meteorological Authority show an unusual pattern of minor seismic events recorded on the Giza Plateau during May and June of 1928. The tremors were small, between 2 and 3.1 on the Richter scale, but their epicenters formed a tight cluster in the area northeast of the Sphinx. The pattern then stopped abruptly in late June. Seismologists reviewing the data decades later noted the events were too regular and too localized to be natural tectonic activity, suggesting they might have resulted from significant subsurface excavation or collapse events. The timing corresponds exactly with the period when Vogel's expedition was most active at the site. Natural tectonic seismic activity typically originates from fault lines or tectonic plate boundaries, where geological stresses accumulate and release through periodic movements. The Giza Plateau sits on relatively stable Eocene limestone formation without major active fault lines in the immediate vicinity. While Egypt experiences occasional earthquakes from tectonic activity along the Red Sea Rift and Mediterranean convergence zones, these events usually originate from known seismic zones and affect broad geographical areas. The tight clustering of epicenters within a few hundred meters represents highly anomalous pattern, inconsistent with natural tectonic processes, which would show either scattered epicenters across fault zones or deep source events radiating outward from central points. The magnitude range 2 to 3.1 represents seismic events strong enough to detect on 1,920 seismographs, but too weak to cause surface damage or attract public attention. Events below magnitude 3 typically go unnoticed by people except those very close to the epicenter, and even then might be attributed to industrial activity, traffic, or other mundane vibrations. This range suggests either the events resulted from relatively shallow underground processes involving modest energy release, or they originated from deeper sources with sufficient damping by intervening rock layers to reduce surface intensity. The consistency of magnitude across multiple events indicates similar causative mechanisms rather than variable natural processes. The timing correlation with Vogel's expedition activities transforms these seismic events from geological curiosity into potential evidence of excavation work. Breaking through sealed chambers, moving massive stone blocks, or collapsing underground structures would generate vibrations detectable by seismographs. The events beginning in May and continuing through June corresponds precisely with the period documented in Blackwood's diary entries, describing their exploration of underground spaces. The abrupt cessation in late June aligns with the period when expedition activities apparently ceased, possibly when they sealed the chamber or encountered circumstances forcing them to abandon work. Modern seismologists' assessment that the pattern suggests significant subsurface excavation or collapse events, provides expert interpretation supporting artificial rather than natural origins. Professional seismological analysis can distinguish between different vibration sources based on frequency characteristics, duration patterns, and propagation signatures. Excavation-related seismic events display different characteristics than tectonic earthquakes. Typically shorter duration, different frequency distributions, and wave propagation patterns reflecting shallow surface sources rather than deep crustal movements. The retrospective analysis indicating these characteristics strengthens the interpretation that the 1,928 tremors resulted from human activities rather than natural geological processes. The phrase collapse events raises disturbing possibilities about what occurred underground during those weeks. Intentional collapse to permanently seal access chambers would explain both the seismic signatures and the expedition's subsequent silence. Unintentional collapse resulting from structural instability in ancient architecture might have threatened expedition members, potentially explaining why some members never returned. The regular spacing of events, multiple separate tremors rather than a single large collapse, suggests either staged demolition work, progressive failure of underground structures under excavation, stress, or series of separate breaching and sealing operations as the expedition accessed multiple chambers or passages. The Egyptian Meteorological Authority's records preservation allowed this correlation to be identified decades later, but there's no evidence authorities in 1928 connected these seismic events with archaeological activities. Standard practice would attribute minor tremors to natural geological processes, unless specific reasons existed to investigate alternative explanations. The expedition's covert nature meant authorities had no reason to correlate detected tremors with unauthorized excavation work they didn't know was occurring. This accidental documentation provided independent physical evidence of subsurface activities during the exact period when Vogel's team was supposedly engaged in work. They went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Among Marcus Reeves' papers was a partially completed translation of what he described as inscriptions from the sealed chamber. The fragment, only about 30 lines long, appears to be his attempt to transliterate and interpret symbols he had recorded. His notes indicate the script was similar in structure to hieroglyphics, but predating known hieroglyphic development. And his translation includes phrases like "before the waters rose," "the star," "watchers," and "the builders of the first time." Modern linguists who have examined these fragments note the symbols don't match any catalogued Egyptian script system, leading some to dismiss them as Reeves' fantasy or misinterpretation. However, a few symbols bear striking resemblance to proto-hieroglyphic markings found in pre-dynastic artifacts from sites like Abydos and Hierakonpolis. The incomplete nature of Reeves's translation, only 30 lines from what were presumably more extensive inscriptions, suggests either his work was interrupted before completion, or these represented preliminary attempts at deciphering the most accessible portions of complex texts. The fact that he described the source as inscriptions from the sealed chamber, rather than using more tentative language, indicates he actually observed and recorded these symbols firsthand, rather than working from second-hand. Descriptions. His characterization of the script as structurally similar to hieroglyphics, while predating their development, implies he recognized organizational principles, directional reading, phonetic, and ideographic elements, determinative markers that aligned with hieroglyphic conventions while employing an entirely different symbol set. The translated phrases carry profound chronological and cultural implications. "Before the waters rose" references catastrophic flooding events that appear across numerous cultural mythologies and potentially correspond to sea level rises following the last ice age's conclusion around 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. If inscriptions in the chamber referenced pre-flood times, they would claim to preserve knowledge from periods conventionally considered prehistoric in Egypt. The Star Watchers suggest sophisticated astronomical observation programs, corroborating Reeves' theories about encoded celestial knowledge in the Giza complex. The builders of the first time echoes Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the mythological first time when God supposedly established civilization, potentially indicating the inscriptions claimed connection to Egypt's most ancient legendary periods. Modern linguistic dismissal of Reeves's symbols as fantasy reflects standard academic skepticism toward evidence that doesn't fit established frameworks. Without access to the original inscriptions for independent examination, linguists can only evaluate Reeves's copies and interpretations. If his symbol recordings contain errors, represent misunderstandings of damaged inscriptions, or reflect his own biases and expectations, the translations would indeed be unreliable. However, dismissing them entirely requires assuming Reeves fabricated the entire enterprise, inventing symbols, constructing fake linguistic systems, and deceiving himself and colleagues about observing chamber inscriptions. Such comprehensive deception seems inconsistent with his established reputation for rigorous astronomical and mathematical work. The resemblance between some of Reeves's symbols and proto-hieroglyphic markings from Abydos and Hierakonpolis provides tantalizing validation. These pre-dynastic sites contain some of Egypt's earliest writing examples, dating to approximately 3,400 to 3,100 BCE, representing transitional stages as pictographic communication evolved into systematic hieroglyphic script. Finding similar symbols in chamber inscriptions could indicate either the chamber dates to this transitional period or its inscriptions deliberately employed archaic writing forms. Either interpretation would support claims about the chamber's extreme antiquity or its creator's intention to encode knowledge using deliberately ancient symbolic systems. Proto-hieroglyphic markings from pre-dynastic contexts remain poorly understood because they appear in limited quantities, with minimal contextual information for interpretation. Linguists have identified certain recurring symbols and can make educated guesses about meanings, but comprehensive understanding remains elusive due to sparse evidence. If Reeves encountered extensive texts employing these or related archaic symbols, the inscriptions could potentially provide crucial context for understanding pre-dynastic writing development, making their inaccessibility a significant loss for linguistic and historical scholarship. Regardless of what other information they might contain about the chamber's origins or purpose, the fragment's survival while Reeves himself disappeared adds to the mystery. Either Reeves managed to send or leave these translation attempts where they would be preserved before whatever fate befell him, or authorities who may have detained him didn't recognize these linguistic fragments as sensitive material worth confiscating. The partial nature of the translation might indicate Reeves deliberately kept these preliminary attempts separate from his main research notes, perhaps anticipating potential loss of his primary documentation, and attempting to preserve at least fragmentary evidence of his discoveries. The fact that even these fragments survived provides rare glimpses into what Reeves observed in the chamber during those crucial weeks in 1928. In 1953, shortly after Edmund Blackwood's death, his daughter reported to Manchester police that someone had broken into the family home. Nothing of obvious value was taken except a framed map that had hung in Blackwood's study, showing the Giza Plateau with various annotations in his handwriting. The police investigation was perfunctory and yielded no suspects. Decades later, Blackwood's daughter mentioned in an interview that she remembered the map showing underground passages marked in red ink, with depth measurements written alongside them, and that her father had always been evasive when asked what the markings represented. She noted that the burglary occurred within a week of her father's obituary, appearing in the Times of London, which mentioned his archaeological work in Egypt in the 1,920 seconds. The selective theft, taking only the framed map, while ignoring valuables typically targeted by ordinary burglars, immediately distinguishes this as targeted acquisition rather than opportunistic crime. Residential burglaries normally involve stolen electronics, jewelry, cash, or other easily fenced items of obvious monetary value. A framed map, particularly one with technical archaeological annotations, would hold significance only to parties specifically interested in Blackwood's Egyptian work. The thief or thieves apparently knew exactly what they were seeking, entered the home with specific acquisition objectives, and ignored everything else to avoid drawing additional attention or extending time spent on the premises. The timing correlation with Blackwood's obituary publication suggests the perpetrators monitored death notices for individuals connected to the 1928 expedition. Obituaries provide convenient public notifications, allowing interested parties to act quickly while families are distracted by funeral arrangements and estate matters. The 1-week gap between obituary publication and burglary allowed time for planning, travel to Manchester, surveillance to determine optimal entry timing, and execution of the theft. This professional approach monitoring, planning, precise execution indicates organizational resources and systematic tracking of expedition participants across decades, suggesting intelligence agencies or the Brotherhood rather than casual treasure seekers. The map's public display in Blackwood's study for years before the theft raises questions about why it wasn't confiscated earlier. Possibly, authorities didn't know Blackwood retained such materials, assuming all sensitive documentation had been destroyed or confiscated during the 1928 to 1929 period. Alternatively, Blackwood's silence and withdrawal from archaeological work may have convinced watchers he posed no threat, making active surveillance unnecessary, until his death created risk that the map might pass to heirs who would recognize its significance and share it publicly. The decision to act only after his death suggests either newfound awareness of the map's existence or calculation that acquiring it during his lifetime would be more complicated or risky. Blackwood's daughter's description of underground passages marked in red ink with depth measurements indicates the map showed extensive subsurface architecture beyond a single chamber. The plural passages suggest network tunnels connecting multiple spaces, while depth measurements imply vertical shaft systems or multi-level construction. This level of cartographic detail would make the map extraordinarily valuable for anyone attempting to relocate or access the sealed chambers, essentially providing a comprehensive roadmap to underground spaces that decades of subsequent investigation failed to definitively confirm or access. Blackwood's evasiveness when asked about the markings reveals his ongoing discomfort with possessing this information, despite displaying it openly. His choice to frame and hang the map suggests complex psychology. Perhaps he needed the visual reminder of his most significant professional achievement, even while knowing he couldn't discuss its meaning. The map's public display might also represent subtle defiance, preserving evidence in plain sight despite pressures to destroy all documentation. By keeping the map visible but refusing to explain its significance, Blackwood maintained connection to his Egyptian discoveries while technically honouring whatever confidentiality agreements or threats constrained him. The police investigation's perfunctory nature, no suspects identified, a case quickly abandoned, suggests either limited investigative effort, typical for low-value property crimes, or possible interference preventing thorough investigation. If the thieves were professional operatives with intelligence backgrounds, they would employ techniques minimizing forensic evidence and potentially possess capabilities to discourage aggressive police investigation through official channels. The fact that even a targeted, the unusual burglary merited minimal investigative attention indicates either the theft was executed with sufficient skill to leave no actionable leads, or authorities were instructed not to pursue the case too vigorously. The map's current location remains unknown, presumably residing in classified government archives, the Brotherhood's private collections, or destroyed after whoever acquired it extracted and documented its information. Its loss represents yet another instance where crucial physical evidence that could definitively resolve questions about the 1928 expedition vanished before modern researchers could examine and independently verify its contents. The pattern of disappearing evidence, Expedition journals confiscated, photographs erased, maps stolen, creates information vacuum that transforms what should be documented historical events into persistent mystery. Geological studies of the Sphinx and its enclosure have consistently detected deep weathering patterns that some researchers interpret as water erosion, requiring sustained rainfall over centuries. The climate of Egypt has been arid for approximately 5,000 years, which would place any extended rainy period firmly before the conventional dating of the Sphinx's construction in 2500 BC. If the chamber discovered by Vogel's expedition showed similar erosion patterns, as Edmund Blackwood's notes suggest it did, this would support theories of a much earlier date for at least some of the Giza complex's subsurface structures. Such evidence would fundamentally challenge the established timeline of Egyptian civilization, explaining why any findings along these lines might have been suppressed by authorities concerned about protecting conventional historical narratives. The water erosion hypothesis, most prominently championed by geologist Robert Schoch in the 1990 seconds, identifies vertical weathering channels and undulating surfaces on the Sphinx enclosure walls, characteristic of precipitation-driven erosion rather than wind-sand abrasion. Wind erosion creates horizontal patterns following prevailing wind directions and affects exposed surfaces relatively uniformly. Water erosion produces vertical channeling as rainfall flows downward, creating distinctive patterns that geological analysis can distinguish from other weathering mechanisms. The depth and extent of these erosion features suggest prolonged exposure to significant rainfall over extended periods rather than occasional storm events. Egypt's paleoclimatic history shows the region experienced substantially wetter conditions during the African humid period, which ended approximately 5,500 to 6,000 years ago. During this period, the Sahara region, including areas now desert, received regular monsoon rainfall supporting grasslands, lakes, and diverse wildlife. As this wet phase ended, the region transitioned toward the arid conditions that have characterized Egypt throughout recorded history. If the Sphinx and associated underground structures were carved and used during the latter stages of this humid period, they would have experienced the rainfall necessary to create observed erosion patterns before Egypt's climate dried completely. Blackwood's notes mentioning similar erosion patterns in the discovered chamber provide crucial corroborating evidence linking subsurface architecture to the same ancient wet period that affected the Sphinx. If chamber walls showed water weathering inconsistent with the limited moisture exposure expected in sealed underground spaces, it would indicate either the chambers were constructed during wetter climatic periods and only later sealed, or water infiltrated sealed spaces over millennia despite engineering efforts to prevent it. The former interpretation supports extreme antiquity, while the latter raises questions about long-term geological processes affecting even sophisticated ancient waterproofing systems. The chronological implications of accepting water erosion evidence fundamentally destabilize conventional Egyptian historical frameworks. Mainstream Egyptology positions the Old Kingdom beginning around 2686 BCE, with the Great Pyramids constructed during the 4th Dynasty, approximately 2580 to 2560 BCE. Pushing construction of major Giza monuments back to periods requiring wet climate conditions would add thousands of years to Egyptian civilization's antiquity, predating the emergence of known pharaonic culture. This would necessitate acknowledging advanced architectural capabilities in populations currently classified as Neolithic or pre-literate, requiring complete reassessment of human civilization's development trajectory. The suppression motivation becomes clear when considering how water erosion evidence undermines not just technical chronology, but cultural narratives about civilization's origins. Modern Egyptian national identity deeply connects to the pharaonic legacy, positioning ancient Egypt as indigenous achievement developed without external influence. Evidence suggesting the most iconic monuments predate known Egyptian dynasties by thousands of years raises uncomfortable questions about who built these structures and what happened to that earlier civilization. Such revelations could diminish Egypt's claim to these monuments' cultural ownership, or suggest that later pharaonic culture inherited rather than created the architectural achievements that define Egypt's historical significance. Academic resistance to water erosion theories reflects institutional conservatism and the social mechanisms that protect established paradigms. Egyptologists built careers on chronologies, cultural interpretations, and historical frameworks that would require fundamental revision if extreme antiquity were accepted. Acknowledging water erosion would invalidate decades of scholarship, textbooks, museum exhibitions, and public education. This creates powerful institutional incentives to dismiss or minimize geological evidence, characterizing it as misinterpretation or emphasizing uncertainties rather than engaging with implications. The result transforms scientific question into ideological battle, where evidence evaluation becomes secondary to protecting established academic consensus. The suppression of Vogel expedition findings, if they documented water erosion in sealed chambers, would serve multiple constituencies: Egyptian authorities protecting national heritage narratives, international archaeological establishments defending orthodox chronologies, and potentially other parties with interests in maintaining historical ambiguity about pre-pharaonic civilizations. The convergence of these suppression motives across different organizations and nations helps explain the comprehensive, enduring silence surrounding the 1,928 discoveries. Despite numerous subsequent attempts to investigate the chamber, and despite mounting independent geological evidence supporting the water erosion hypothesis. The last photograph on the undamaged rolls from Blackwood's camera shows the 12 members of the expedition standing at the base of the Sphinx, taken in late June 1928, based on the light and shadows. The men are dressed in work clothes covered with limestone dust, and several are holding surveying equipment. What draws attention in the photograph, however, is the expression on their faces. Unlike the confident, professional demeanor common in archaeological expedition photographs, these men look exhausted, even haunted. Vogel stands slightly apart from the others, his hand raised as if he's about to speak or warn the photographer of something. The photograph has been analysed by forensic psychologists who note the body language suggests significant psychological stress, inconsistent with a routine scientific expedition. Period archaeological expedition photographs typically display pride, accomplishment, and professional confidence. Teams pose formally beside discoveries, equipment, or monuments, projecting competence and scientific authority. These images serve professional purposes, documenting personnel, demonstrating expedition legitimacy, and creating records for publications and presentations. Participants understood photographs would represent their work to funding sources, academic institutions, and public audiences, creating strong incentives to project positive, professional images regardless of actual field conditions or personal feelings. The contrast between typical expedition photography conventions and this final image's atmosphere makes its emotional content particularly striking. The exhaustion visible in the men's faces suggests physical and psychological depletion beyond what normal archaeological labor would produce. While fieldwork in Egypt's climate certainly causes fatigue, professional expeditions maintain schedules allowing adequate rest, and participants were typically young, healthy men accustomed to demanding physical work. The level of exhaustion captured in the photograph implies either sustained overwork without adequate recovery time, or psychological stress manifesting in physical deterioration. The description of faces appearing haunted indicates something beyond simple tiredness. Haunted expressions suggest trauma, fear, or profound psychological disturbance, emotions reflecting encounters with experiences that challenged mental equilibrium or confronted individuals with disturbing realities. Such expressions in a group photograph indicate shared experience rather than individual psychological issues, suggesting all expedition members encountered something that affected them similarly. The collective nature of this psychological impact corroborates accounts describing the chamber's contents or implications as profoundly unsettling to those who witnessed them. Vogel's isolated positioning and warning gesture transform the photograph from documentary record into dramatic moment frozen in time. Standing apart from the group suggests either deliberate distancing or spontaneous reaction, separating him from collective positioning. His raised hand in apparent warning implies he saw something concerning in the moment the photograph was taken. Or perhaps symbolic gesture, attempting to prevent documentation of the group at that particular moment. His body language suggests urgency and concern, incompatible with routine photography sessions. Forensic psychological analysis of photographs examines micro-expressions, posture, proxemics, and non-verbal communication patterns to assess subjects' emotional states. Such analysis in this context would evaluate muscle tension visible in faces, eye contact patterns, shoulder positions, hand placement, and spatial relationships between individuals. The professional assessment noting significant psychological stress, inconsistent with a routine scientific expedition, indicates trained observers detected markers of anxiety, fear, depression, or trauma beyond what fieldwork challenges would explain. These assessments consider cultural and historical context, understanding that Victorian and Edwardian era men typically maintained stoic public presentations, making visible emotional distress even more significant. The limestone dust-covering work clothes confirms active excavation or subsurface exploration immediately before the photograph. Limestone dust accumulates during cutting, breaking, or handling limestone blocks, and would be present on clothing after working in underground chambers carved from limestone bedrock. The quantity and coverage suggest intensive recent work rather than incidental exposure from surface activities. This physical evidence corroborates claims that the expedition engaged in substantial underground excavation work, likely in the sealed chamber they reportedly discovered. The photograph's timing in late June 1928 positions it near the apparent conclusion of the expedition's active phase, shortly before members began departing Egypt and the documentary silence descended. As potentially the last image capturing the complete team together, it represents a visual record of their final moments at the site, before whatever dispersal, disappearances, or suppression followed. The men in this photograph stood at a threshold between their discoveries and the subsequent decades of silence, their faces perhaps reflecting awareness that what they'd witnessed would be suppressed, disbelieved, or concealed, leaving them isolated with knowledge they couldn't share. In 2009, during a routine maintenance inspection of the Sphinx, workers reported hearing unusual acoustic reverberations coming from beneath the monument when heavy equipment was operated nearby. The reverberations suggested the presence of large hollow spaces at depth, consistent with the chamber system described in Blackwood's maps. Egyptian authorities briefly closed the area to tourists while conducting tests, then announced the reverberations were simply echoes off the bedrock and presented no structural concerns. A sound engineer working as a tourist at the time recorded the reverberations on his phone and later had them analysed by acoustic specialists who concluded the echo patterns were consistent with manufactured spaces approximately 25 to 40 meters below the surface, likely containing straight passages and rectangular chambers. Acoustic reverberations provide diagnostic information about subsurface structures because sound waves behave predictably when encountering different materials and voids. Solid bedrock produces characteristic reflection patterns with minimal sustained reverberation. Hollow spaces create extended echo decay times as sound bounces within enclosed volumes before dissipating. The size, shape, and depth of voids affect reverberation characteristics. Larger spaces produce longer decay times. Rectangular chambers create distinct patterns different from natural caves, and depth influences frequency attenuation. These acoustic signatures allow specialists to infer subsurface architecture from surface-generated vibrations, The maintenance equipment inadvertently provided acoustic testing by generating sufficient ground vibrations to excite resonances in subsurface structures. Machinery like jackhammers or compactors produces powerful, sustained vibrations at various frequencies, essentially functioning as crude seismic sources. When these vibrations encounter hollow spaces, they generate resonant responses. The voids amplify certain frequencies while absorbing others, creating distinctive patterns audible at the surface. Workers' immediate recognition that reverberation seemed unusual suggests acoustic effects were pronounced enough to notice without specialized equipment. Egyptian authorities' rapid response, closing the area and conducting tests, indicates they took anomalies seriously enough to warrant immediate investigation and public exclusion. The subsequent official explanation, attributing reverberations to simple bedrock echoes, represents dismissive conclusion, contradicting the initial seriousness with which authorities treated the discovery, suggesting investigation revealed findings officials decided required downplaying rather than acknowledgement. The tourist sound engineer's recording represents fortunate documentation of phenomena authorities preferred to dismiss. His professional background likely prompted him to recognize reverberations as acoustically interesting and worth documenting. His decision to seek professional analysis transformed casual documentation into scientific evidence challenging official explanations. The acoustic specialist's conclusion about manufactured spaces, approximately 25 to 40 meters below the surface, provides remarkably specific characterization based solely on recorded reverberations. Professional acoustic analysis can estimate void dimensions from decay times, infer geometry from reflection patterns, and calculate depth from frequency attenuation. The assessment that spaces contained straight passages and rectangular chambers indicates patterns inconsistent with natural caves, which produce irregular acoustic signatures. The geometric regularity suggests deliberate architectural construction rather than geological accident. The depth range aligns closely with multiple independent sources. Blackwood's maps indicating depths around 50 meters, the 1,974 radiation anomaly at 25 meters, and 1,952 British Reconnaissance reporting sealed entrances at significant depth. This convergence across different detection methods, time periods, and investigating parties strengthens claims about substantial subsurface architecture. The rectangular chamber characterization particularly corroborates Blackwood's drawings, showing organized spaces rather than natural voids, representing human construction requiring deliberate excavation and planning. The official dismissal reflects standard institutional response to evidence requiring acknowledgement of underground structures, accepting that reverberations indicated subsurface chambers would lead to demands for excavation, investigation, and public disclosure, attracting international attention and pressure. By dismissing evidence as insignificant, authorities avoided these consequences while maintaining control over narrative and access to whatever exists below the surface. The complete story of what Heinrich Vogel's expedition found beneath the Giza Plateau in 1928 may never be fully known. The evidence that remains is fragmentary, scattered across archives in 3 continents, held in private collections, or locked away in restricted files that governments claim don't exist. What is certain is that a group of credentialed scientists and experienced archaeologists spent months working at one of the world's most studied archaeological sites, found something that profoundly affected them, and then either vanished or returned home to lives marked by silence and shadow. Whether they discovered evidence of a civilization older than history records, whether they found something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development, or whether they simply stumbled into political intrigue and paid the price for knowing too much. The question remains, suspended in the same darkness that filled the chamber they opened 9 decades ago. The pattern of evidence suppression spans too many institutions, nations, and decades to dismiss as coincidence. German institutes denied Vogel's existence. British files documented incidents immediately buried. French archives showed systematic removal of materials, and Egyptian authorities repeatedly blocked investigations. American and Soviet intelligence maintained active interest throughout the Cold War. This international convergence suggests either extraordinary coordination to protect shared interests in historical orthodoxy, or independent recognition that the chamber's contents pose challenges each party preferred to suppress rather than publicly acknowledge. Modern technology continues, generating evidence supporting the expedition's claims. Ground-penetrating radar detects subsurface voids, seismic analysis reveals anomalies, acoustic reverberations suggest manufactured spaces, and satellite imaging identifies subsurface features. Each detection method independently corroborates elements of Blackwood's maps and Vogel's discoveries. Yet, each confirmation encounters dismissive official responses and bureaucratic obstacles. The consistency of this suppression across different technologies and eras indicates active, ongoing effort to prevent definitive confirmation of what lies beneath the Sphinx. The fundamental questions remain unanswered. If the chamber exists as evidence suggests, what does it contain that warrants such sustained suppression? If astronomical alignments encode dates from 10,500 BCE, as Reeves calculated, what civilization possessed such knowledge? If water erosion indicates exposure during Egypt's wet period, how do we reconcile advanced architecture with populations considered pre-literate? If recovered metalwork displays sophisticated techniques, what does this reveal about ancient capabilities that surviving records fail to document? The expedition's story illuminates how institutions manage uncomfortable knowledge, threatening established narratives. The mechanisms employed: permit manipulations, archive confiscations, diplomatic interventions, and sustained obstruction reveal systemic approaches to controlling information likely applied to other archaeological discoveries. How many expeditions encountered evidence quietly buried? How many researchers self-censored to protect careers? How much accepted chronology reflects genuine evidence versus institutional preferences? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that truth about human civilization's antiquity differs substantially from official narratives, and institutions have deemed public awareness too destabilizing. If Giza's monuments encode knowledge from civilizations predating recorded history, if the chamber contains evidence of sophisticated ancient capabilities, if implications would require fundamentally revising our understanding, then sustained suppression might reflect calculated decisions about what truths societies can accept. The chamber remains sealed beneath limestone, protected by bureaucratic barriers more formidable than stone. Until authorities permit investigation, until classified files open, until the conspiracy of silence breaks, the truth will remain buried, waiting in darkness as it has for nearly a century, guarded by those who decided some secrets are too dangerous for daylight.